Section 1. Stark Raving Dad. The Michael Jackson episode that disappeared for 30 years. There is an episode of The Simpsons that aired on the 19th of September, 1991, that almost nobody under the age of 35 has ever seen in the context it was originally intended to be seen in. It was the premiere episode of Season 3. It was, at the time, the most watched episode the show had ever produced. It featured one of the most famous human beings on the planet in a voice role so secretive that the credits listed the character as being voiced by a fictional person named John J. Smith. That name was fake. The voice belonged to Michael Jackson. And for nearly 3 decades, that episode titled Stark Raving Dad aired in syndication, ran on Fox, got included in retrospectives, and was watched by millions of people who either didn't know the backstory or knew it and found it charming and strange. Then in 2019, the episode was permanently pulled from circulation. Not paused, not delayed, removed. Every streaming platform lost it, every rerun schedule dropped it. Fox stopped airing it. The showrunners announced that it was gone, and they used a specific word when they announced the decision. They called it the right thing to do. This is the story of how that happened. How a single episode of a cartoon became a cultural artifact so radioactive that the people who made it chose to erase it from their own legacy. And to understand why that decision carried the weight it did, you have to go back to the beginning, to the autumn of 1990, when someone on The Simpsons writing staff had an idea so audacious that it probably should never have worked. The idea was simple on its surface. What if Homer Simpson was institutionalized, and while he was in the mental health facility, his roommate was a large white man who believed he was Michael Jackson? The character's name was Leon Kompowski. He was a brick mason from New Jersey. He spoke in the unmistakable cadences of Michael Jackson's speaking voice. He had the gentle, childlike energy that the real Michael Jackson had cultivated so carefully in his public persona throughout the late 80s and into the 90s. And in the world of the episode, everyone who encountered Leon had the same reaction. This man is either completely delusional or something very strange is happening. The writing staff, led at the time by showrunner Al Jean and Mike Reiss, had quietly approached Michael Jackson about the possibility of providing the voice himself. And this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Jackson agreed. He agreed on the condition that the credit list a pseudonym rather than his name, and he agreed, at least according to most accounts, without asking for any payment at all. He wanted to do it as a creative experiment. He wanted to do it because The Simpsons was, at that moment, perhaps the most culturally relevant television program in America, and the idea of appearing on it invisibly, secretly, in a role that allowed him to play with the mythology surrounding his own public image, appealed to him in a way that straightforward celebrity appearances apparently did not. Now, there is a complication in this story that the show's own producers have acknowledged over the years. While Jackson performed the speaking voice of Leon Kompowski, a sound-alike named Kip Lennon actually sang the 2 songs that appear in the episode. So even the voice itself was partly a construction, partly a performance layer built on top of a performance. Jackson spoke the dialogue. Lennon sang the songs. And the whole thing was credited to a man named John J. Smith who did not exist. The episode itself is warm and genuinely affecting in a way that makes the subsequent history more complicated, not less. Homer is sent to a mental health facility after wearing a pink shirt to work and being diagnosed as insane by Mr. Burns, which is one of the show's more elegant bits of satire about how institutions define normalcy based on the preferences of the powerful. While there, Homer meets Leon, who tells him that he is Michael Jackson and asks Homer to call him Michael. Homer, being Homer, accepts this immediately and without significant skepticism because Homer's relationship with celebrity and fame is one of cheerful, uncomplicated credulity. The episode's emotional center is a subplot involving Bart having forgotten Lisa's birthday. Throughout the episode, the character who calls himself Michael helps Bart understand the weight of what he's done and helps him write a song for Lisa as an apology. The song, titled Happy Birthday Lisa, is the moment that makes people cry if they're watching it in the right frame of mind. It's a simple, sincere, musically gentle little piece that works precisely because it doesn't try to be a big moment. It's a small gesture of love from a brother to a sister, delivered through the most unlikely possible intermediary, and it lands the way the best Simpsons emotional moments land, by arriving before you've had time to prepare for it. The episode aired. The ratings were extraordinary. For the third season premiere of a show that was already one of the most popular programs on television, the numbers came in at a level that exceeded almost everyone's expectations. The secret of Jackson's involvement was maintained with surprising effectiveness for an industry notoriously incapable of keeping secrets. Some journalists suspected. Some people who worked in proximity to the production knew. But the general viewing public largely accepted John J. Smith as a voice actor doing a remarkable impression of Michael Jackson, or they accepted the deliberate ambiguity the show had constructed around the question of whether Leon actually was Michael Jackson. The show was careful about this. It never confirmed or denied within the text of the episode itself. Other characters react to Leon with a range of responses that mirror exactly the range of responses a real person might have. Some people believe him instantly. Some people are deeply skeptical. Marge suggests that if he really were Michael Jackson, he probably wouldn't be in a mental health facility in Springfield, which is a very Marge thing to say, and also a pretty reasonable point. The ambiguity was the point. It allowed viewers to exist in the joke at multiple levels simultaneously. If you knew Jackson had done the voice, the episode rewarded that knowledge with layers of self-aware comedy about the construction of celebrity identity. If you didn't know, the episode functioned as a gentle, funny, touching story about a man whose claim to fame is the strangest thing about him but not the most important thing about him. For almost 30 years, this is how the episode existed in the world. It was beloved. It was frequently cited in discussions of the show's best work. In 2003, it was ranked by Entertainment Weekly as one of the greatest television episodes ever made. It had a reputation, a warm and well-deserved one, as an example of what The Simpsons could do when its ambition and its heart were pointed in the same direction. And then came Leaving Neverland. The documentary, directed by Dan Reed and released by HBO in 2019, presented detailed accounts from Wade Robson and James Safechuck, two men who alleged that Michael Jackson had sexually abused them as children over the course of several years. The allegations were not new in the sense that accusations against Jackson had circulated for decades. Jackson had faced criminal charges in 2003 and 2005 and had been acquitted of all counts in June 2005. He maintained his innocence until his death in 2009. But Leaving Neverland was different in its form and its effect. It was 4 hours long. It was granular and specific and deeply personal in a way that previous reporting about Jackson had rarely been. It premiered at Sundance in January 2019 and generated a cultural conversation of a scale and intensity that hadn't been seen around the Jackson allegations in many years. People who had maintained uncomplicated affection for Jackson's music and legacy found themselves struggling to reconcile that affection with what Robson and Safechuck were describing in terms that allowed very little room for emotional distance. The showrunners, Al Jean and James L. Brooks, announced their decision within weeks of the documentary's release. They were removing Stark Raving Dad from all platforms, from all syndication packages, from all future airings. They framed the decision in moral terms. This was not a dispute about the quality of the episode. This was not a programming decision based on ratings or relevance. This was a declaration that continuing to broadcast an episode that prominently featured Michael Jackson's voice and personality in a warm, celebratory way felt wrong in the context of what the documentary had presented. Al Jean was quoted as saying that the episode no longer felt appropriate to show. He acknowledged that the decision was unusual and that it was not without cost. The episode represented a genuine creative achievement, and its removal meant erasing something the show was proud of. But he maintained that the right thing and the comfortable thing were not the same thing in this case, and that the show was choosing the right thing. James L. Brooks, one of the show's original executive producers and a figure whose creative authority over the series is unparalleled, used language that was even more direct. He described the removal as an attempt to do right by people who had been harmed. He was careful not to position the decision as a definitive judgment on Jackson's guilt. The legal situation remained what it had been after the 2005 acquittal, with Jackson deceased and unable to defend himself, and the accounts of Robson and Safechuck disputed by Jackson's estate. But Brooks made clear that in the context of those accounts, the continued broadcast of an episode that effectively celebrated and humanized Jackson felt like something the show could not justify. The reaction to the removal was itself a minor cultural event. There was a significant contingent of fans and critics who felt that pulling the episode was an overreaction, that it conflated the work with the man in a way that set a troubling precedent that removing art because of the behavior of people associated with it was a slippery slope that could justify almost any act of cultural erasure. These arguments were made thoughtfully by serious people who were genuinely grappling with the tensions between art and biography, between the intentions of a creative work and the biography of the person whose presence shaped it. There was another contingent who felt the decision was correct and perhaps even overdue, who argued that The Simpsons had benefited commercially and reputationally from Jackson's participation for nearly 30 years, and that declining to continue that benefit in the wake of serious abuse allegations was the minimum appropriate response rather than some extraordinary act of moral courage. And there was a third group, perhaps the largest, who felt genuine sadness about the removal of an episode they had loved, who held the competing feelings of affection for the work and discomfort about the person without arriving at a clean resolution, because clean resolutions to questions like this one rarely exist. What makes this particular scandal interesting as a piece of Simpsons history is that the episode itself contains, entirely by accident, a kind of uncomfortable irony that nobody could have anticipated when it was written. The episode is centrally about a man whose identity is a performance. It is about the gap between who someone says they are and who they actually are. It is about the way celebrity creates a kind of mythology around a person that obscures whatever reality exists underneath. Leon Kompowski claims to be Michael Jackson, and the episode never fully resolves whether he is or isn't, and the point is partly that the question of whether someone is the person their public face suggests they are might be unanswerable from the outside. Nobody writing that episode in 1990 was thinking about any of this in the terms that would later become unavoidable. They were making a funny, warm show about a cartoon family, and they had the extraordinary luck to get one of the most famous people in the world to help them do it. The resonances that accumulated over the decades that followed were not intended. They were the product of time and circumstance, and the particular weight that certain stories acquire as the world changes around them. The episode still exists, of course, in the sense that physical media doesn't disappear just because a corporation decides to stop distributing it. People who own the Season 3 DVD set still have it. Clips exist online in the fragmented, impermanent way that everything eventually exists online. The episode has not been destroyed. It has been withdrawn, which is a different thing, and the distinction matters both legally and culturally. What it represents in the history of The Simpsons is something genuinely new for the show. In 36 years of production, Stark Raving Dad is the only episode that has been deliberately and permanently removed from circulation by the people who made it. Every other scandal the show has generated, and there have been many, as we're going to spend the next several hours exploring, resulted in controversy, debate, occasional rewrites, and sometimes public apologies. None of them resulted in erasure. The fact that this episode is the one that crossed that threshold says something about the particular weight of what the documentary alleged and about the particular intimacy of the episode itself. Jackson didn't provide a brief cameo. He didn't lend his likeness for a background sight gag. He voiced the central guest character of an episode built around themes of identity and celebrity and the way we project our ideas about famous people onto the complicated humans who actually live inside that fame. His performance is the episode. And the episode is warm and funny and genuinely moving. That's what makes the removal feel like a loss, even to people who understand and accept the reasoning behind it. The episode is good. It might be one of the best the show ever made. And it is gone, or as close to gone as anything can be in the age of digital reproduction, because the person at its center turned out to be allegedly contested, complicated something other than what his public persona suggested. There is a version of this story that is purely sad. There is a version that is purely about accountability. There is a version that is about the impossible position that art puts us in when we discover that the people who made it did terrible things. None of those versions is complete on its own. What you are left with when you hold all of them at once is something that The Simpsons itself has always been good at depicting: the messiness of human beings. The way love and harm can come from the same source. The way the things we cherish can become complicated without ceasing to be cherished. The show built 36 years of storytelling around the idea that the Simpson family was a mess and also the thing worth fighting for. The episode at the center of its most significant scandal reflects that same irresolvable contradiction. The episode is titled Stark Raving Mad. The title comes from the phrase Mr. Burns uses when he sees Homer in the pink shirt and concludes that Homer has lost his mind. But in the years since the documentary, the phrase has taken on a different resonance. The starkness of the raving, the madness of the situation, the way a story about a gentle man singing a birthday song to a little girl became, with the accumulation of years and revelations, something far more difficult to hold. Springfield doesn't forget things. According to the theories we began this journey with, Springfield resets. Springfield maintains the agreed-upon version of reality. But this time, the town that Springfield made its home in the real world, which is under no obligation to reset, decided to remember differently, and the episode went away. Drop a comment below with the time you're watching this and where in the world you're watching from. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in a completely different time zone is listening to the same story at a completely different hour. And if you want more of this, more of these slow, detailed dives into the hidden history of a show that has been part of all of our lives for longer than we can sometimes believe, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, and they only get stranger from here. Section 2. Some Enchanted Evening, the pilot that almost killed the show before it could be born. Most people assume The Simpsons arrived fully formed. They picture Matt Groening sketching the family in a waiting room, the show getting picked up, and then 36 seasons of television history flowing naturally out of that originating moment. The reality is considerably messier and considerably more interesting. The show nearly died before a single episode aired, and the episode that almost killed it was the very first one they finished. To understand the scale of what went wrong, you need to know a little about how The Simpsons came to exist at all, and about the pressure that surrounded its creation in a way that made failure feel not just possible but likely. The show began as a series of animated shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show, a Fox variety program that premiered in 1987. The shorts were crude by almost any standard of measurement. Limited animation, rough character designs, plot lines that were essentially extended sight gags rather than stories. They had charm, and they had Groening's particular sensibility, which mixed working-class frustration with genuine warmth in a way that felt different from most comedy being produced at the time. But they were shorts. They were brief. They were warm-up acts. When Fox decided to develop the shorts into a full half-hour series for the 1989-90 television season, they were making a bet on an unproven concept in an unproven format. Primetime animated series for adult audiences had not worked in America since the Flintstones in the early 1960s. The conventional wisdom in the television industry was absolute and had been maintained for roughly 2 decades. Animation was for children, primetime was for live action, and anyone who tried to mix the two was either foolish or desperate. Fox, which was itself a young and precarious network at the time, was exactly desperate enough to try. They had limited programming inventory, limited budget, limited credibility with advertisers, and a mandate from Rupert Murdoch to find something, anything, that could compete with the established networks on Thursday and Sunday nights. The Simpsons was a gamble, and everyone involved understood that. The production company brought in to animate the show was a Korean studio called Klasky Supo, which would go on to produce Rugrats and Daria, and several other significant animated series. But in 1989, they were still establishing themselves, still developing their processes, still figuring out how to translate the aesthetic of Groening's sketches into a consistent animated style that could be produced at the pace and volume required by a network television schedule. The first episode to be completed, the one that was intended to air as the series premiere, was called Some Enchanted Evening. It was episode 13 in production order, which was assigned to be the first episode broadcast. The story involved a babysitter later named Miss Botts, and played with memorable Menace, who turns out to be a wanted criminal nicknamed the Babysitter Bandit. The plot had genuine comic momentum, the family dynamics were recognizable, and the writing showed the confidence that would eventually make the show a landmark. And then the animation came back from Korea, and everything fell apart. The problems were not subtle. The problems were not the kind of thing you might notice if you were watching casually or didn't know what you were looking for. The problems were fundamental, visible to anyone with eyes, of the sort that would have made the episode impossible to broadcast in any form that the network or the production company would have been willing to put their names on. Characters moved strangely. Proportions shifted between shots in ways that felt less like stylistic choice and more like quality control failure. Backgrounds didn't match their corresponding foreground elements. The lip sync, which is one of the most basic technical requirements of animation, was consistently wrong in ways that ranged from slightly distracting to genuinely bizarre. James L. Brooks, who was one of the show's executive producers and who had a background in live-action television that had trained him to recognize when something was not working at a fundamental level, saw the rough cut and reportedly said something to the effect that this could not air. The specific language varies depending on who is telling the story, but the substance is consistent across accounts. The episode as delivered was not acceptable. This put the show in an extraordinary position. The premiere date was approaching. Fox had committed to the series. Promotional materials had been produced. The network had begun building expectations with advertisers and with the press. And the first completed episode was, according to the people responsible for its quality, not ready. The decision that was made, and this is the decision that saved The Simpsons, was to complete a second episode first and air that one as the premiere instead. The episode selected for this purpose was Bart the Genius, a story about Bart switching test papers with another student, being classified as a genius, and being sent to a school for gifted children where his actual intellectual limitations become painfully apparent. It was a story with strong comic logic, clear emotional stakes, and a setup that introduced the family's dynamics without requiring the audience to already know who everyone was. Bart the Genius aired on the 14th of January 1990 as the series premiere of The Simpsons. It was received well. The show established itself. The audience came back for the second episode, and the third, and the fourth, and the show found its footing in ways that nobody in the television industry had predicted and most had actively doubted. Some Enchanted Evening eventually aired on the 13th of May, 1990, as the 13th episode of the first season. By that point, the animation had been substantially corrected, not completely, but enough that the episode was watchable, and the audience that had spent several months falling in love with the Simpson family was forgiving about the remaining rough edges in a way that a cold-open premiere audience would never have been. But the near catastrophe of the pilot had ripple effects that extended far beyond the scheduling adjustment. It created a crisis of confidence in the production pipeline that forced the show's producers to examine their processes, their quality standards, and their relationship with the overseas animation studios in ways that shaped the show's visual identity for years to come. The experience also established something important about the creative culture of The Simpsons that would prove relevant in several of the scandals we'll discuss later in this script. The people running the show had standards, and they were willing to make expensive, complicated, disruptive decisions to maintain those standards. Brooks and Groening and the writing staff had a clear picture of what The Simpsons was supposed to be. And when the execution fell short of that picture, they were willing to delay, to redo, to sacrifice short-term convenience for long-term quality. That cultural disposition, the willingness to call something not good enough and start over rather than broadcast something substandard, would manifest differently in different contexts as the years went on. Sometimes it protected the show. Sometimes it produced the kinds of creative decisions that look like overcorrection from the outside. But it was always there, always part of the DNA of how the show operated, and it originated in the panic and the hard decisions of those first few months before the premiere. There is also something worth noting about what Some Enchanted Evening contained, beyond the animation problems, that made its near absence from the premiere date a more complicated loss than it might appear. The episode was, in certain respects, a more confident piece of storytelling than Bart the Genius. The babysitter plot had genuine suspense, not the cartoon peril of later action-oriented episodes, but the specific domestic anxiety of leaving your children with someone you don't fully know. Miss Botts, the babysitter bandit, is genuinely threatening in a way that early Simpsons villains rarely were. She is competent, she is calm, and she is dangerous, and the episode's comedy comes from the contrast between the cheerful mundanity of babysitting and the specific horror of what she's actually there to do. Bart and Lisa, in the episode, discover who Miss Botts really is and manage to tie her up only for Homer, returning home and having no idea what has happened, to untie her and let her go, thinking his children have been misbehaving. It's a genuinely dark joke, played with surprising restraint. Homer's cheerful obliviousness enables a criminal's escape. The family is safe by accident rather than by competence, and nobody learns anything in a way that sticks. This is very much The Simpsons that would define the show's golden era. Characters failing in recognizably human ways. Consequences that are real but not catastrophic. Comedy that comes from character rather than from situation. The episode earned its place in the rotation, even coming last rather than first. The scandal of Some Enchanted Evening is quieter than the scandals that followed it. There was no protest, no boycott, no congressional hearing about cartoon babysitters. The drama was internal, professional, the kind of crisis that plays out in screening rooms and production meetings rather than in op-ed pages or network executive offices. But it mattered. The show almost began differently. The first image America would have had of the Simpson family might have been a warped, misaligned, technically deficient version of them, and that first impression might have been unrecoverable. Instead, the show got a second chance to make a first impression, took that chance, and became something that would run for 36 years and generate enough actual public scandals to fill several hours of detailed discussion. The babysitter episode being pushed to last is, in retrospect, a small and perfect metaphor for something the show would spend decades doing: finding the back door when the front door was blocked, making the unconventional choice that turned out to be the right one, surviving its own near disasters with just enough grace to keep going. It is also worth considering the parallel between the show's own near-death experience and the content of the episode that nearly killed it. A family left alone with someone who turns out to be dangerous. A rescue that happens not because someone was competent or vigilant, but because the situation resolved itself through the specific chaos of being a family. An ending that is fine, that is okay, that involves everyone getting through relatively intact despite all the reasons they shouldn't have. That is also pretty much the story of how The Simpsons got to air at all. The situation resolved itself through chaos. Everyone got through relatively intact. And the show that emerged from that process would go on to generate decades of stories about exactly that kind of messy, contingent, improbable survival. The babysitter came back, in a sense. In a later season, Miss Botts reappearing in a brief cameo that rewarded attentive viewers who remembered the first season. The show has a long memory, even when its characters don't. And the memory of what almost went wrong in the months before the premiere is part of what shaped the particular vigilance that the show's best creative period was built on. There are other dimensions of the show's difficult birth that deserve attention. The relationship between the writing staff and the network was complicated from the very beginning, and many of the tensions that would produce later scandals were present in embryonic form even before the first episode aired. Fox wanted a show that would attract young male viewers, which was the demographic the network had identified as most valuable to the advertisers it was trying to recruit. The Simpsons provided that, but it also provided something the network hadn't quite bargained for: a show with genuine satirical ambition, a show that was willing to say things about American society and American institutions that network television had generally avoided saying. The Simpsons was not a safe show dressed in cartoon clothing. It was a genuinely dangerous show that happened to be animated. That combination, the animation providing a kind of plausible deniability, the content pushing further than the format was expected to push, is what made so many of the show's scandals feel surprising, even when, in retrospect, they seem inevitable. Of course, The Simpsons was going to anger someone. Of course, it was going to push into territory that made people uncomfortable. That was its nature, and its nature was visible from the very first episode, once you knew what you were looking at. The near disaster of Some Enchanted Evening was, in its way, the universe's first attempt to stop something that couldn't be stopped. The show found a way through, and then it spent the next 3.5 decades making sure there was always a scandal worth finding its way through. Section 3. Homer's Phobia, the episode Fox tried to bury and why it aired. Anyway. Television executives in the mid-1990s operated according to a set of assumptions about what American audiences would tolerate that now feel almost charmingly antiquated. The assumptions were not entirely without basis. Public attitudes were genuinely different in 1997 than they are today, and what strikes a contemporary viewer as basic human decency looked to many network decision-makers of that era like an invitation to advertiser revolt. But the way those assumptions were applied, the specific decisions they produced, and the stories of what happened when creative people pushed back against them are worth examining in detail. Homer's Phobia is an episode of The Simpsons that aired on the 16th of February, 1997. It was written by Ron Houge and directed by Mike B. Anderson. It is, by the consensus of critics, fans, and the Television Academy, that gave it an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, one of the finest episodes the show ever produced. It is funny and sharp and emotionally generous and formally inventive in the way that the best episodes of the classic era always were. It is also the episode that Fox executives initially refused to air, that sat on a shelf for over a year while the network and the showrunners argued about whether it should be broadcast, and that was eventually forced onto the schedule only after the showrunners made clear they had no intention of withdrawing it. The episode introduces a character named John, voiced by John Waters, the filmmaker behind Pink Flamingos and Hairspray, and several other films that occupied a specific and distinctive position in American underground and mainstream culture. John is gay, openly and cheerfully so, and he becomes friends with the Simpson family after Marge discovers his vintage kit shop. He's charming and warm and funny and generous, and the family's various responses to him are perfectly calibrated to their characters. Marge likes him immediately. Lisa is delighted. Bart is fascinated. And Homer, once he realizes that John is gay, becomes increasingly and irrationally anxious. The episode is explicitly about homophobia. That's not a reading or an interpretation. The episode is called Homer's Phobia, and the phobia it's about is named in the episode. Homer's discomfort with John is presented as irrational, as cowardly, as unworthy of him, and the episode does not provide him with a comfortable resolution where he gets to maintain his discomfort while still being sympathetically portrayed. By the end, Homer has been forced by circumstances to recognize John's basic decency and human value, and while the episode doesn't suggest that Homer's phobia has been cured, the show is rarely so optimistic about people's capacity for rapid fundamental change. It does suggest that he's been given a reason to examine it. John Waters' performance is extraordinary in a way that took the show's guest casting to a different level. The show had been bringing in celebrities since its earliest seasons, but the celebrity appearances in the first several years often felt like the show accommodating the guest rather than the guest serving the show moments, where the animation stopped to acknowledge that a famous person was present, where the story bent itself around the cameo rather than integrating it. Waters didn't do that. His John is a character, a fully realized human being who exists in the world of the episode with as much specificity and presence as any of the regular cast. He's not doing a John Waters impression. He's doing something that uses his particular voice and persona but channels them into the service of the story. The specific Fox executive objections to the episode, as reported by the showrunners over the years, were not articulated as objections to the episode's quality. Nobody at the network claimed the episode wasn't funny or well-made. The objections were about fear specifically. The fear that advertisers would withdraw their support from the show if it broadcast an episode that presented a gay character sympathetically, that critiqued homophobia directly, and that did so without the kind of hedging and qualification that the network felt would make the content palatable to a broader audience. The advertising landscape of mid-90s American television was structured around the assumption that certain subjects were radioactive. Homosexuality was near the top of that list. The conventional network wisdom was that showing a gay character in a positive light would trigger boycott calls from conservative advocacy organizations, that those calls would reach advertisers, that advertisers would pull their commercials to avoid the controversy, and that the financial cost of this chain of events would outweigh any artistic or social benefit the episode might provide. What's striking about this reasoning, in retrospect, is not that it was entirely without basis. This exact chain of events had occurred in other contexts, and the network's fears were grounded in real experience. What's striking is how completely the calculation ignored the possibility that the episode might also generate positive attention, that there might be an audience for whom seeing their lives or their identities reflected honestly on a mainstream television show had value, and that that value might translate into loyalty and viewership in ways that had commercial significance. The showrunners at the time, the Season 8 production was overseen by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, with Al Jean and Mike Reiss's fingerprints also present from the preceding seasons. Institutional culture pushed back on the network's decision to shelf the episode. The specific mechanics of how the pushback worked and how the episode eventually made it to air involve a combination of contractual obligations, the Writers Guild implications of not broadcasting completed work, and the simple fact that the showrunners were unwilling to quietly accept the executive decision and move on. There are accounts suggesting that the delay lasted close to a year. There are accounts suggesting that the showrunners threatened to go public with the network's refusal to air the episode if Fox continued to suppress it. There are accounts suggesting that the Emmy nomination the episode eventually received it was submitted for consideration before it aired, which created its own procedural complications, provided a kind of external validation that made the network's position harder to maintain. Whatever the precise mechanics, the episode aired. And when it aired, the catastrophe that the network had feared did not materialize in the form they expected. There were complaints. There were letters. There were calls to affiliates from organizations that objected to the episode's content and tone. But the advertiser exodus did not happen. The ratings did not collapse. The show did not lose its audience or its commercial viability. What the episode gained was something harder to quantify and more durable than a ratings victory. It gained a reputation. It became, in the years following its broadcast, a touchstone for discussions of how mainstream entertainment could engage with subjects that were often treated as too sensitive for mass audience television. It was cited by critics, by academics, by LGBT advocacy organizations, and eventually by the Emmy Awards, as an example of what popular culture could do when it decided to treat its audience as capable of engaging honestly with difficult subjects. The episode is also, it's worth emphasizing, extremely funny. The humor is not incidental to the episode's seriousness. The two exist in the relationship that the best Simpsons episodes always achieved, where the comedy provides the vehicle for the emotional and moral content rather than serving as a distraction from it. Homer's specific fears are funny because they're so precisely irrational. His concern that John might be making Bart gay, which plays out in a sequence involving deer hunting, that is one of the more brilliantly absurdist things the show ever did, is a perfect satirical distillation of the particular unreason that underlies so much homophobia. The fear that gayness is contagious. The fear that exposure to gay people will cause susceptible people, particularly young men, to become gay themselves. The episode takes this fear seriously enough to let Homer voice it fully, and then lets the absurdity of the fear emerge naturally from the situation, rather than having another character lecture Homer about how wrong he is. John Waters has spoken about the episode in interviews over the years with a combination of pride and measured reflection. He's noted that the character named John in the episode is not exactly him, it's a version of him filtered through the show's sensibility, which is a different thing. He's noted that the experience of recording the episode was collaborative in ways he hadn't expected, that the writers were genuinely interested in getting the character right in a way that went beyond simply deploying him as a symbol of gay identity. He's also noted, with characteristic dryness, that being voice cast in a show where Fox executives tried to suppress your episode is its own kind of credential. The episode arrived at a specific moment in American cultural history. 1997 was the year Ellen DeGeneres came out on her sitcom in an episode that generated enormous controversy and, eventually, the cancellation of the show. The conversations happening in those months about gay visibility in mainstream entertainment were raw and contested in ways that are genuinely hard to convey to someone who has grown up in a media environment where gay characters are common across the broadcast landscape. The stakes felt higher because they were higher. What television showed people, and how it showed them, mattered in ways that were directly connected to people's physical safety and social acceptance. Homer's phobia did not resolve the culture wars of the 1990s. It did not by itself change the landscape of gay representation in American entertainment, but it did something specific and valuable. It demonstrated that a show with a massive mainstream audience could treat a gay character with full humanity, could critique homophobia directly and honestly, and could do so in a way that was entertaining and effective, rather than preachy or alienating. It also demonstrated something about the show itself. The willingness of the showrunners to fight for the episode, to refuse to accept the network's suppression of completed work that they believed in, was not incidental to what The Simpsons was. It was central to it. The show's ability to say things that other shows wouldn't say depended on the people making it, being willing to take the kinds of professional risks that the Fox executives who tried to shelf Homer's phobia were not willing to take. The episode won the Emmy. It is available on streaming. It has been watched millions of times since its initial broadcast and continues to find new audiences among people who are discovering the show's classic era for the first time. The intervention that Fox tried to perform on it failed completely, and the thing it failed to suppress became one of the defining arguments for why the show mattered. There is one more detail about Homer's phobia that deserves mention, because it sits at the center of the episode's most resonant moment. Near the end, after the deer hunting sequence has gone spectacularly wrong and Homer and John are facing a real threat from a malfunctioning attraction at a steel mill that is also implicitly and somewhat surreally a gay bar, John saves Homer, not metaphorically, not through the power of acceptance or the emotional logic of the redemption arc, literally physically saves him from the automated machinery that is trying to kill him. And Homer's response, confused, grateful, still not entirely at ease but clearly moved, is not a clean conversion. He doesn't suddenly understand everything or accept everything or become someone different from who he was at the start of the episode. He just says something to the effect that John didn't have to do that, and John says something about how Homer would have done the same, and Homer thinks about it and says he wouldn't have. It's a small, honest, slightly dark joke, Homer being Homer. And it lands perfectly because it's true. Homer is not heroic. Homer is often selfish and small and frightened. But in this episode, he encountered someone who was generous and funny and kind and who did not require Homer to be a better person before extending that generosity to him. That is, in the end, what makes Homer's phobia worth fighting for. Not its political content, though that content matters. Not its Emmy Award, though that recognition is deserved. Its willingness to let its characters be who they are, flawed and small and capable of moments of recognition even when they're not capable of transformation, and to trust that an audience paying attention will recognize something true in that portrait. Fox tried to bury it. The show survived the attempt. The episode is still here. Section 4. Screaming Yellow Honkers. The episode that sparked a national conversation about road rage. There is a particular kind of television scandal that doesn't involve a protest or a boycott or a congressional hearing or a network executive sending something to the shelf. It's the scandal of influence, the suggestion that a piece of entertainment was responsible for changing the behavior of people who watched it, that the ideas it presented or normalized contributed to something harmful in the real world. These scandals are harder to resolve than almost any other kind, because the causal chain they're asking you to accept is long and complicated, and almost impossible to prove or disprove definitively. Screaming Yellow Honkers aired on the 21st of February, 1999, during the show's 10th season. It's an episode about road rage specifically, about Homer Simpson purchasing an SUV called the Canyonero and developing an aggressive, dangerous driving personality that he can't control. The episode is funny, and it's also surprisingly thoughtful about the specific psychology of road rage, about why mild-mannered people become dangerous behind the wheel, and about the way certain vehicles, particularly large, powerful ones, seem to encourage aggressive driving in ways that their smaller predecessors don't. The episode arrived at a particular moment in American life. In the late 1990s, road rage had become a genuine public health concern. The term itself had been coined in the mid-1980s by a Los Angeles television reporter describing a series of incidents on the freeway system, but by the late 1990s it had entered the mainstream vocabulary and was being discussed in congressional hearings, insurance industry studies, and psychological research papers. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had identified aggressive driving as a significant contributor to traffic fatalities. States were beginning to add road rage provisions to their traffic laws. The AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety published a study in 1997 estimating that aggressive driving was a factor in more than half of all fatal traffic accidents. Into this conversation stepped The Simpsons, as it frequently did, with a satirical treatment of the subject that was sharp enough to illuminate what was real about the phenomenon while being funny enough to generate the specific kind of social commentary that lands when it's embedded in entertainment rather than delivered as a lecture. Homer's transformation in the episode follows a specific and recognizable arc. He begins as a nervous, anxious driver, which is itself funny, given Homer's general disposition, who finds that the Canyonero, with its elevated position above other traffic, its sense of physical dominance over smaller vehicles, and its various intimidating features, changes how he feels while driving. He becomes aggressive, he becomes reckless. He begins using the vehicle as an extension of a need for control and power that he experiences as exhilarating in the moment and that he cannot turn off when he gets out of the car. The satire operates on multiple levels. There's the commercial satire, aimed at the SUV boom that was transforming American roads in the late 1990s. There's the psychological satire, which engages with the research on what driving psychology researchers call the cockpit effect. The way an enclosed vehicle creates a sense of privacy and anonymity that permits behavior drivers would never engage in as pedestrians. There's the class satire embedded in the specific features of the Canyonero and in Homer's aspirational relationship with a vehicle that is clearly designed for a kind of rugged outdoor lifestyle that Homer does not and has never lived. And there's the gender satire, which is the element that made the episode most unusual for its time. The Canyonero is marketed specifically to men. "She'll make you feel a big man," runs one of the parody jingles, but it turns out to be a vehicle designed by its manufacturer specifically for women, which is why the steering wheel is on the wrong side for Marge's comfort. When Homer's road rage is deemed a danger to himself and others, Marge takes over the Canyonero, and the ending of the episode is about Marge dealing with her own emerging road rage personality that the vehicle seems to activate. This detail that the vehicle produces aggressive driving behavior in both Homer and Marge, that the psychology of road rage is not limited to one gender, was considered unusually thoughtful for a popular entertainment treatment of the subject. Road rage was frequently discussed in gendered terms in the late 1990s, often as a specifically male phenomenon connected to testosterone and competitive instincts. The episode complicated that framing without making a big deal of the complication, just letting it be present in the story. The controversy that attached itself to the episode was not immediate. It developed over time, as road rage incidents continued to appear in the news, and as commentators looking for cultural explanations of the phenomenon began pointing to entertainment that depicted aggressive driving in terms that could be read as glamorizing it. The Simpsons episode was cited in some of this discussion, though rarely as a primary culprit, more as an example of how the culture had normalized aggressive driving as a source of comedy, rather than treating it with appropriate seriousness. The show's position in this discussion was uncomfortable and somewhat unfair. The episode is explicitly critical of road rage. Homer's behavior is presented as dangerous and wrong, not as heroic or admirable. The episode ends with consequences, with Marge's road rage threatening her family's safety in ways that are played for genuine alarm as much as for comedy. The episode is not a celebration of aggressive driving. It's a satire of the conditions that produce it. But satire's relationship with its subject is always complex, and one of the consistent criticisms of satirical treatment of harmful behaviors is that the humor creates a kind of distance that makes the behavior seem less serious than it is. When Homer cuts off another driver in a way that the episode frames comedically, the laugh that results might be understood as the audience endorsing the behavior, or at least accepting it as normal, in ways that a more serious treatment would not permit. The road rage controversy was one of several cultural anxieties of the late 1990s that attached themselves to entertainment with varying degrees of justification. Video game violence, television violence, music, lyrics, all were being scrutinized in this period for their potential contributions to a public mood that felt, to many observers, unusually aggressive and volatile. The Simpsons was generally exempted from the most serious versions of these critiques, partly because its cartoon format made literal imitations seem implausible, and partly because the show's satirical intentions were well understood by most commentators. But Screaming Yellow Honkers is worth examining in detail for what it reveals about how the show navigated the relationship between entertainment and social commentary. The episode is funny about road rage in a way that serves the commentary rather than undermining it. It doesn't make Homer's aggression look cool. It makes it look like what it is: a failure of impulse control, a response to the specific conditions that the SUV market of the 1990s was deliberately cultivating, a psychological vulnerability that most people would prefer not to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean examining their own behavior behind the wheel. The episode's most prescient element, in retrospect, is its analysis of the vehicle's role. The Canyonero gives Homer a feeling of power. The elevated position above other traffic creates a psychological condition in which other drivers seem smaller, more abstract, less fully human. The anonymity of the enclosed cab removes the social inhibitions that would normally prevent Homer from screaming at strangers. The episode was describing, in 1999, dynamics that traffic safety researchers would spend the next 2 decades documenting in increasingly detailed studies of how vehicle type correlates with driving aggression. That prescience is another example of what the show's defenders always cited when the Simpsons predicted this conversation came up. The writers were not oracles. They were paying attention to research and trend data that was available to anyone who was looking. and they were able to translate that data into narrative comedy with enough skill and clarity that the result felt, years later, like prophecy. The Canyonero itself became one of the show's more durable running jokes, returning in subsequent seasons in ways that continued to engage with the specific cultural anxieties around large vehicle ownership in America. The song Canyonero became a cult item among fans with a particular appreciation for the show's commercial parodies. The episode remained in heavy rotation for years after its initial broadcast. No congressional hearing was called. No boycott was organized. The specific controversy around screaming yellow honkers was more diffuse and more ambient than the specific scandals that surrounded some of the show's other provocations. But it sits in this collection of troubled episodes because it represents a consistent pattern in The Simpsons' relationship with American culture. The show would identify a genuine social problem, treat it with both humor and seriousness, generate some controversy among people who felt the humor undermined the seriousness, and then watch as subsequent years provided evidence that the show's analysis had been largely correct. Road rage is still a significant public safety concern. SUVs are still disproportionately involved in pedestrian fatalities. The psychology of how vehicle size affects driver behavior is still being studied and documented. And Homer Simpson's Canyonero is still sitting there, in the archive. A cartoon artifact that managed to be funny and true simultaneously, in a way that the best television always achieves. Section 5. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson? What happens when a cartoon becomes unwatchable? There are episodes of television that become associated with events they had nothing to do with. Events so enormous, so catastrophic, that proximity alone becomes a form of contamination. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson premiered on the 21st of September 1997. For 4 years, it was a well-regarded, frequently rerun comedy episode about Homer's resentment of New York City and his miserable attempt to retrieve his car from the World Trade Center. It contained incidental visual content establishing shots, background details, the kind of texture that animation uses to make a setting feel real that included, as establishing shots of Manhattan almost inevitably would, the Twin Towers. On the 11th of September 2001, the Twin Towers were destroyed. Approximately 3,000 people were killed. The nature of American life changed in ways that were immediate and profound, and the ripple effects of that morning touched almost every aspect of American culture, including its entertainment. For network affiliates and rerun syndicators in the weeks and months following September 11th, programming decisions that had been automatic and unconsidered became complicated overnight. Shows and films and episodes that contained visual references to the Twin Towers, and there were many. Given that the towers had been a prominent feature of the New York City skyline for nearly 30 years, now carried an emotional charge that made them difficult to broadcast without seeming either insensitive or deliberately provocative. The Simpsons pulled The City of New York versus Homer Simpson from syndication immediately following the attacks. The decision was made by the same logic that governed dozens of similar decisions across the entertainment industry in those months. In the immediate aftermath of catastrophic loss, content that prominently featured images associated with that loss felt inappropriate to broadcast, regardless of the context in which those images appeared. This was widely understood and generally not controversial as an immediate response. The pulling of the episode in the weeks following September 11th was part of a broader adjustment that the entertainment industry made across multiple platforms and formats. Films were delayed, scenes were edited, trailers were pulled. The adjustment was temporary in most cases, a recognition that the country needed time to grieve and that entertainment companies had both commercial and ethical reasons to be sensitive to that need. What made the City of New York situation different was the duration. The episode was not simply delayed for a few weeks and then restored to rotation. It remained out of syndication for years. Different local affiliates had different policies, and the situation was complicated by the fact that the episode aired in syndication rather than on Fox's network schedule, which meant there was no single corporate decision point, but rather a distributed set of choices made by individual stations and syndicators. The episode eventually returned to wider availability, though the timeline varied significantly by market and platform. When it did return, it was sometimes edited. The background content featuring the Twin Towers was in some broadcast versions digitally altered or cropped. In other versions, the episode aired in its original form with the understanding that viewers watching it were watching it with the full knowledge of what had happened. The specific content of the episode, beyond the Twin Tower imagery, is relevant to understanding why the pulling created its own secondary controversy. The episode is a comedy about Homer hating New York. This was, in 1997, a fairly standard premise. New York City was frequently the subject of jokes about its expense, its crowding, its noise, its particular abrasiveness, and its gap between the idealized version of the city and the lived experience of actually being in it. Homer's specific grievances include bad parking, aggressive vendors, general urban chaos, and a boot placed on his car near the World Trade Center that requires him to spend an entire day waiting for a city official who doesn't show up until very late in the afternoon. None of this content had anything to do with terrorism or with the specific catastrophe of September 11th. The episode contained no prescient details, no uncomfortable parallels. The Twin Towers appear in establishing shots as background context. They are not part of the story. They are simply there, as they would have been in any visual representation of Manhattan in 1997, because they were part of the city. The controversy about the episode's continued absence from syndication in the years after the initial pulling was driven largely by fans who felt that the indefinite suppression of a comedy episode because of incidental visual content in its backgrounds was an overreaction that served no meaningful purpose. Their argument was essentially that the episode, watched by anyone who knew what they were watching, did not trivialize the events of September 11th, did not exploit the tragedy, and did not contain anything that could reasonably be considered offensive. It was simply a comedy about Homer not liking New York, and the presence of the Twin Towers in its backgrounds was a historical fact rather than a provocation. The counter-argument, advanced by some critics and by the affiliates that maintained the episode's absence, was that the decision about what to broadcast was ultimately about what audience members experienced when they watched, and that some audience members, particularly those who had lost people on September 11th or who had been in New York that morning, might find the casual appearance of the Twin Towers in a comedy context painful in ways that justified caution. Both arguments have merit. The tension between them is not easily resolved, and the resolution that eventually occurred, the episode's gradual return to rotation, in some versions edited and in others not, is less a resolution than an accommodation to the passage of time and the changing nature of what the images meant in an evolving cultural context. What the city of New York versus Homer Simpson represents in the history of Simpsons scandals is something specific and worth naming clearly. The capacity of external events to retroactively transform the meaning and the cultural status of entertainment that had nothing to do with those events. The episode was not scandalous when it aired. It became scandalous, or at least problematic, at least complicated because of what happened to the city it depicted 4 years later. This is a dynamic that the show would encounter in other contexts, though rarely with the same weight or scale. Episodes that made jokes about institutions, technologies, or cultural practices that subsequently became associated with tragedy sometimes felt different after the tragedy than they had before it. The floating timeline that the show operates on, always in the present, always relevant to the moment it was made, means that its relationship with history is continuous and sometimes uncomfortable. The show's past is always available for comparison with the present, and sometimes that comparison produces dissonance rather than recognition. The episode is fully available now on streaming platforms and in physical media. It airs in its original form. The Twin Towers appear in the backgrounds of the establishing shots because removing them would be its own kind of falsification, its own way of pretending that history was different from what it was. The episode is a period piece now, in the way that all 36 seasons of The Simpsons are period pieces, artifacts of the specific moments that produced them. Watching it today requires the kind of double awareness that watching a lot of old television requires, holding simultaneously the context of creation and the context of viewing, knowing that things changed between the two. Homer still hates New York in the episode. The city is still drawn with all the exasperated affection that the show always brought to its renderings of American institutions. The Twin Towers are still there in the skyline. And the comedy still works, in the way that comedy can work even when it carries extra weight that wasn't present when it was written. The episode was pulled. It came back. The city it depicted rebuilt itself, in ways both literal and metaphorical. And the cartoon family that visited it and found it frustrating and funny and overwhelming is still there, still frozen at the same ages, still driving back to Springfield in a car that probably shouldn't make it that far. Section 6. Blame it on Lisa. the episode that created a diplomatic incident. There is a specific category of offense that is worse than offending individuals or advocacy groups, offending an entire country. It generates a different scale of response, involves different institutional actors, and produces a different kind of cultural aftermath. The Simpsons managed this feat with surprising efficiency in 2002 when it aired an episode about Brazil that prompted the Brazilian government to make formal protests about the portrayal of their country, inspired a tourist board to demand an apology, and generated diplomatic correspondence at a level rarely associated with animated television. The episode was Blame It on Lisa, which aired on the 31st of March 2002. The premise involves the family traveling to Rio de Janeiro to find a Brazilian orphan named Ronaldo, whom Lisa had been sponsoring and who has disappeared. The episodic logic of traveling somewhere exotic to find something lost is a classic Simpsons setup, and the show had used it before the family's travels to Japan, to the United Kingdom, to New Zealand, with results that were generally well regarded as affectionate, if exaggerated, portraits of the destinations involved. Brazil was a different experience for the Brazilians who watched the episode. The Rio depicted in Blame It on Lisa is a city of kidnappings, child poverty, municipal chaos, dangerous animals including street-level caimans, and various other tropical calamities. Homer is kidnapped by a cab driver almost immediately after arriving. The city's infrastructure is chaotic. The streets are dangerous. The orphanage where Ronaldo has been living is a somewhat grim establishment. The show deploys the visual and narrative shorthand of tropical South American dysfunction that is familiar from decades of Hollywood treatment of the region, and it deploys it at a pace that leaves little room for the counterbalancing affection that makes the show's treatments of other foreign destinations feel like ribbing rather than disparagement. The Brazilian government did not respond quietly. The Minister of Tourism at the time gave public statements calling the episode an insult to Brazil. The Brazilian company that managed Rio's tourism promotion issued a formal demand for an apology from Fox and from the Simpsons production company. Rio de Janeiro's official tourism website published a response to the episode. Brazilian diplomatic channels were engaged in conversations about the appropriate response to what Brazilian officials characterized as a damaging misrepresentation of their country that could affect tourism revenue and international perception. The response from the show's American producers was measured and somewhat unapologetic. They noted that the show satirizes everywhere that Springfield itself is a disaster, that America is a frequent target of the show's satire, that the caricature of Brazil was in the same tradition as the show's caricatures of everywhere else it had depicted. They pointed out that the episode contained genuine beauty in its depictions of Rio's landscape, and genuine humor that was not purely mean-spirited. They suggested that the Brazilian authorities were perhaps not the most reliable judges of what constituted satire versus defamation. None of this was wrong exactly. The show's argument that it caricatures everything equally has some validity as a general defense of satirical comedy, and the specific traditions of the show's international episodes were relatively consistent across different countries. But it missed something important about the particular history of how Brazil and Rio de Janeiro had been represented in American entertainment, and about what it means to receive a specific kind of representation when you have been receiving that kind of representation for a long time. The Hollywood tradition of depicting Latin American cities as chaotic, dangerous, poverty-stricken places populated by criminals and buffoons is long and not distinguished. By 2002, Brazilian audiences and Brazilian officials had been receiving this kind of treatment from American entertainment for decades. The Simpsons episode arrived in a context where it was not a single isolated caricature, but one in a long series, and the cumulative weight of that series is different from the weight of any individual item within it. There's also a specific issue with the kidnapping plot that Brazilian critics focused on with particular intensity. The image of a foreign tourist being kidnapped as essentially the first thing that happens upon arriving in Rio carried real-world implications in a way that a joke about Springfield's nuclear reactor did not. Tourism is a significant economic sector for Brazil, and Rio specifically is one of the most recognizable tourism brands in the world. The representation of the city as a place where violent crime against tourists is routine and immediate had the potential to discourage visitors in ways that would have genuine economic consequences. The show did not apologize in the terms the Brazilian government requested. The specific diplomatic standoff eventually resolved itself through the passage of time and the show's general policy of not issuing country-to-country apologies for satirical content. But the incident produced a meaningful internal conversation within the show about how it depicted foreign countries and what obligations it had to the people who lived in those countries. The conversation was not simple, because the show's satirical tradition depicting everything as slightly dysfunctional, slightly corrupt, slightly more dangerous and chaotic than it actually is genuinely applied across the board. The show makes Springfield a disaster. It makes Homer's workplace a hazard. It makes the American government incompetent and its institutions corrupt. The logic of applying the same treatment to foreign countries is not inconsistent, but the specific power dynamics of American entertainment depicting other countries are not symmetric with American entertainment depicting itself. When The Simpsons satirizes America, the satirized entity has its own robust entertainment industry capable of responding in kind, has global cultural reach that provides context for the satire, and has a complex enough representation in global media that no single satirical portrayal carries disproportionate definitional weight. When The Simpsons depicts Brazil, the power imbalance is different. American entertainment has historically had enormous influence on how countries like Brazil are perceived internationally, and Brazilian entertainment has had considerably less influence on how America is perceived. This doesn't mean The Simpsons was wrong to set an episode in Brazil, or that any satire of foreign countries is inherently illegitimate. It means that the consideration of what a satirical portrait does requires attending to context to the history of representation, the power dynamics between the representing and the represented, and the likely real-world effects of the representation. The episode also generated significant discussion in Brazil itself about media representation, about the cultural power of American entertainment, and about how a country responds when its image is managed primarily by foreign producers who may understand the country's geography but have at best a superficial relationship with its culture and its people. These conversations were more productive in some ways than the formal diplomatic protests because they engaged with the underlying dynamics rather than simply demanding an apology for a symptom. The show eventually acknowledged the incident in characteristic Simpsons fashion, with a brief, self-aware reference in a later episode that demonstrated awareness of the controversy without exactly constituting an apology. This was the show's standard response to most controversies, the sly acknowledgement that it knew what it had done and was confident enough in its satirical credentials to let the acknowledgement speak for itself. Brazil continued to be referenced in subsequent Simpsons episodes, generally with somewhat more care than had been evident in Blame It on Lisa. The tourism board never received the formal apology it had requested. Rio de Janeiro's image in international media continued to be shaped by a combination of genuinely stunning visual material the city is, from many perspectives, extraordinarily beautiful, and the persistent narratives about crime and chaos that The Simpsons episode had drawn on and reinforced. The episode stands as a case study in the limits of the "we satirize everyone equally" defense. Equality of satirical treatment is only meaningful if the various subjects of that treatment are equally positioned to absorb it, respond to it, and provide countervailing representations of themselves. When they're not, when the power differential between the satirist and the satirized is significant, the equal treatment principle can function as a kind of false equivalence that ignores how representation actually works. The Simpsons understood this in some contexts better than in others. Its treatment of American institutions of government, of corporations, of religion, of the media demonstrated consistent sophistication about the relationship between power and comedy. Its treatment of foreign countries was sometimes less sophisticated, and Blame It on Lisa is the episode where that inconsistency generated its most significant real-world consequences. Section 7. Goo Goo Gai Pan, the episode that got The Simpsons banned in China. If the Brazilian diplomatic incident was uncomfortable, the Chinese response to a 2005 episode of The Simpsons was categorically different in scale and consequence. China didn't protest the episode through tourist boards or ministerial statements. China took a simpler approach. It banned The Simpsons from its primetime television schedule entirely. Goo Goo Gai Pan aired on the 13th of March 2005 during the show's 16th season. The episode follows the Simpson family to China, where Selma Bouvier, Marge's sister, a character defined by a combination of romantic disappointment, genuine warmth, and mordant wit, is attempting to adopt a Chinese baby. The adoption plot drives the family's visit, and the visit generates the usual assortment of cultural observations satirical exaggerations, and character-based comedy that the show's international episodes typically produced. The episode contained several elements that Chinese authorities found objectionable, and understanding the specificity of those objections requires understanding something about the political and cultural sensitivities of the Chinese context in 2005. The most significant problem was a reference to Tibet. The episode depicts a museum in China that contains an exhibit featuring a historical timeline. The timeline, as depicted in the show, describes Tibet as a Chinese territory, followed by a description of events that Chinese authorities read as presenting the official Chinese position on Tibet's status in a way that was either mocking that position or presenting it as contested. The specific framing was ambiguous enough that it could be read multiple ways, which did not make Chinese officials more charitable toward it. There were also jokes about Chinese infrastructure, about the treatment of political dissidents, about Tiananmen Square, and about the Chinese government's relationship with its own citizens that ranged from mildly pointed to fairly direct in their satirical intent. The episode was not subtle about the political dimensions of what it was depicting. The showrunners understood that taking the Simpson family to China in 2005 meant engaging with a political context that was not simply a backdrop for cultural fish-out-of-water comedy. The Chinese government's response was to use the incident as the occasion for a broader regulatory action affecting animated content from foreign countries on Chinese primetime television. In 2006, Chinese broadcasting regulators issued guidelines restricting foreign animated programs from primetime scheduling, creating a protected space for domestic animation production. This was partly an economic policy. The Chinese animation industry had been arguing for regulatory protection from foreign competition, and partly a political response to the concern that foreign entertainment was presenting content that Chinese authorities wanted to control. The Simpsons was identified specifically in some reporting on the regulatory change as among the content that had prompted the action, though the regulations were broad enough to affect foreign animation generally rather than being targeted specifically at the show. The situation placed The Simpsons in an unusual and somewhat uncomfortable position in the ongoing American media conversation about China. The show had essentially become a test case in the debate about whether entertainment companies should self-censor to maintain access to the Chinese market, a debate that was already active in 2005, and that would intensify dramatically in subsequent years as China's economic influence over American entertainment companies grew. The Simpsons had not self-censored. The episode contained what it contained, and when China objected, the show did not offer to alter or remove the content in exchange for continued access to the Chinese market. This was consistent with the show's general disposition toward external pressure on its content, the same disposition that had kept Homer's phobia on the schedule, despite Fox's attempts to suppress it, that had refused to issue the apology Brazil requested over the Rio episode, that had generally treated demands for editorial capitulation as occasions for editorial stubbornness. In the specific context of China, this stubbornness carried different implications than it did in other contexts, because the scale of the potential market and the political stakes of the relationship were different. American entertainment companies in the mid-2000s were actively pursuing access to the Chinese market, which required navigating the Chinese government's content regulations in ways that often meant altering or removing content that officials found objectionable. The major Hollywood studios were making these accommodations in various ways, sometimes explicitly and sometimes quietly. The Simpsons not making them was, in that context, a more significant choice than it might have appeared to observers who weren't tracking the broader industry dynamics. The episode itself is separate from the controversy it generated, a somewhat mixed piece of work by the standards of the show's classic episodes. The Selma adoption plot has genuine emotional weight. Selma is a character who has been defined throughout the series by loneliness and a desperate desire for connection, and the episode takes that seriously in a way that makes the ending affecting. The China comedy around it is broader and less precise than the show at its best, leaning more heavily on exaggerated cultural difference than on the character-based specificity that made episodes like 30 Minutes Over Tokyo or the New York episode genuinely funny. But the episode's quality as television is somewhat beside the point of its significance as a cultural and political event. What matters is that it demonstrated the limits of the "we satirize everything" defense in a context where the satirized party was capable of taking action that had real consequences for the show's distribution. Brazil had protested. China had acted. The distinction was instructive. The Chinese ban on foreign animation in primetime did not ultimately prevent The Simpsons from being available in China through other channels. Pirated versions of the show circulated on Chinese internet platforms throughout the period of the broadcast restriction, as they had before it. The availability of the show to Chinese audiences who wanted to watch it was not effectively curtailed by the regulatory action. What the action changed was the show's commercial relationship with Chinese state television and with the mainstream Chinese broadcast market. The episode also generated discussion about the appropriateness of the show's treatment of the Chinese adoption process, which some adoptive parents and adoption advocates felt was handled carelessly. The episode's comedy around Selma's attempt to satisfy the bureaucratic and documentary requirements of international adoption from China included jokes about corruption and bribery that some viewers felt undermined the seriousness of the process and could reinforce negative perceptions of Chinese adoptions. This was a more internal American controversy, less about China's political objections and more about the concerns of a specific community of Americans with a particular connection to the episode's subject matter. The tension between these two sets of concerns, the Chinese government's political objections to the episode's satire of its policies, and the American adoptive community's concerns about the episode's treatment of the adoption process, illustrated how a single episode could generate completely separate controversies with completely separate grounds, requiring completely separate kinds of response. The show navigated both controversies in the way it usually navigated controversy, by continuing to be The Simpsons, by not issuing apologies that the situation didn't require, and by making subsequent episodes that reflected whatever adjustments in approach seemed warranted, without explicitly acknowledging that any adjustment had occurred. China's relationship with American entertainment continues to be one of the defining commercial and political tensions of the contemporary entertainment industry. The debates that Gugu Gai Pan participated in 2005 are larger and more explicitly contested now than they were then. The question of what American content creators owe to access to the Chinese market and what they should be willing to give up to maintain that access is one that the industry has not resolved and may not be capable of resolving cleanly. The Simpsons, in its particular way, set its position on the question early and has maintained it. What the show says is what the show says, and access to markets that don't want to hear it is not worth the cost of not saying it. Section 8. The Principal and the Pauper, the episode that broke the fan base. Every television show has an episode that its most devoted fans point to as the moment things changed. For The Simpsons, that episode is almost universally agreed to be The Principal and the Pauper, which aired on the 28th of September 1997 during the 9th season. The episode is not controversial in the way that most entries in this script are controversial. There was no boycott, no foreign government protest, no network suppression. The controversy was internal, passionate, deeply felt, and in some respects continues to this day. The episode revealed that Principal Skinner, one of the show's most beloved recurring characters, was not who he appeared to be. His real name was Armin Tamzarian. He had assumed the identity of the real Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam War veteran, decades earlier, and had been living inside that stolen identity ever since. The episode aired, the fan base rebelled, and the show's response to that rebellion, which was essentially to acknowledge the criticism in a way that doubled down on it, produced one of the most interesting meta-controversies in the show's history. To understand why the episode generated the reaction it did, you need to understand what Principal Skinner meant to the show's audience by 1997. Skinner had been a central character for 8 seasons. He was, in many respects, the show's most complete portrait of a specific kind of American male failure, the person who has organized his entire life around an institution, in this case, Springfield Elementary, and whose relationship with authority is simultaneously its most defining feature and its most limiting one. He was defined by his relationship with his mother Agnes, by his rivalry with Bart, by his tortured professional relationship with Superintendent Chalmers, and by a persistent sense of defeat that the show treated with affection rather than cruelty. The character had a history. He was a Vietnam veteran. He had specific memories of his time in Vietnam that had been referenced and developed across multiple episodes. He had a relationship with his mother that was rooted in specific events from his past. He had a personality that felt like the product of a particular set of experiences, the authority-respecting, rule-following, fundamentally decent but chronically unfortunate man who he appeared to be. The Principal and the Pauper erased all of that. If Skinner was Armin Tamzarian, a street punk from New Jersey who had assumed Skinner's identity, then the Vietnam veteran backstory wasn't real. The specific memories weren't real. The relationship with Agnes was built on a lie that she may or may not have been fully complicit in. Everything that had been established about Skinner across 8 seasons was now retroactively false, or at best fictional in a different way than it had been fictional before. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among several other characters on the show, made his objections to the episode public in ways that were unusual for a performer with his relationship to the production. Shearer has been a member of the principal cast since the beginning and has a deep investment in the characters he voices. He described the episode as a mistake and indicated that he had raised concerns during the production process. His willingness to speak publicly about his disagreement with a creative decision made by the show's writers was itself notable. The cast generally maintained a unified public face, even when internal disagreements existed, and his choice to go on record suggested that his concerns were serious enough that he was willing to accept the professional awkwardness that came with voicing them publicly. The showrunner response to the fan backlash and to Shearer's public dissatisfaction was to include a meta-commentary on the controversy in a later episode. The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, a clip show from an earlier season, had already established the show's willingness to acknowledge its own internal contradictions. But the more pointed response came in a Season 9 episode that ended with Judge Snyder, the character who had, in The Principal and the Pauper, issued the legal decree that the imposter Tamzarian would henceforth be recognized as the real Skinner, making a brief, apparently self-aware reference to the controversy in terms that suggested the show knew exactly what it had done and was not particularly troubled by knowing it. This response enraged some fans more than the original episode had. The meta-acknowledgement was read as the writers patting themselves on the back for a creative decision that the audience had rejected, as evidence that the show valued its own cleverness over its audience's emotional investment in its characters. The sense was that the show was telling its fans that their attachment to the continuity of the character was less sophisticated than the writer's willingness to undermine it. The deeper argument about the episode divides into 2 camps that have been arguing with each other since 1997. On one side are those who feel that the episode was a creative betrayal, that the writers, either carelessly or deliberately, destroyed a beloved character for no sufficient reason, and that the destruction was irreversible in a way that diminished the show's accumulated achievement. On the other side are those who feel that the episode, whatever its execution flaws, was doing something genuinely interesting, questioning the nature of identity, exploring what makes a character real within a fictional universe, and demonstrating the show's willingness to examine its own conventions rather than simply maintaining them. The argument about the episode is also, unavoidably, an argument about what The Simpsons should be. The classic era's characterization was rooted in specific histories, specific relationships, specific memories that gave the characters weight and consistency. The later era's willingness to treat continuity as optional, to use characters as vehicles for whatever a given episode's writer wanted to explore without regard for what earlier episodes had established, was something that many fans traced directly to the precedent set by The Principal and the Pauper. Whether or not that's a fair attribution, whether the episode was a cause of the show's later relationship with continuity, or merely an early symptom of tendencies that were already present, the episode has served as a cultural marker in discussions of the show's trajectory in ways that few other individual episodes have. What makes the episode genuinely interesting as a piece of Simpsons history, separate from the controversy it generated, is the way it puts in explicit theatrical form dynamics that the show usually keeps implicit. The town voting to maintain a lie, the legal decree criminalizing the truth, the exile of the inconvenient real thing in favor of the comfortable fiction. These are things the show does metaphorically all the time, through the floating timeline and the episodic reset and the collective amnesia. The episode made them literal, put them on the stage, named them clearly, and the audience responded not with appreciation for the explicitness but with fury at the confirmation that this was how Springfield worked. Maybe the fury was the point. Maybe the episode was a provocation designed to make the audience feel what it would feel like to be the real Seymour Skinner, the person with the legitimate claim who gets tied to a train and expelled from their own story. Maybe the writers were doing something genuinely interesting with the relationship between the audience's emotional attachment to fictional characters and the arbitrary authority of the people who control those characters. Or maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe the episode is exactly what the angry fans said it was: a creative decision that valued cleverness over care, that treated a beloved character as a plot mechanism rather than as the accumulated work of 8 years of consistent characterization. Both things can be true simultaneously. The most interesting creative failures are often the ones where the ambition was real but the execution created something you can't take back. Skinner has never been quite the same character since. The show has largely operated as if the episode didn't happen. Tamzarian is rarely mentioned. The specifics of the reveal are treated as something to be stepped around rather than integrated. This is itself a kind of irony. The episode that was supposed to reveal something true about the character's identity has been treated in subsequent years as if it's the lie rather than the revelation. Section 9. Homer Badman. The episode written as a response to real accusations. Sometimes a television show responds to real-world events by creating a fictional parallel that is unmistakable in its intentions, but maintains enough distance to function as story rather than as direct commentary. Homer Badman, which aired on the 27th of November 1994, is the clearest example in Simpsons history of this kind of response. An episode written in direct engagement with a specific cultural conversation that was happening in the real world at the exact moment the episode was in. Production. The episode involves Homer being falsely accused of sexual harassment. The specific incident is absurdly innocent. Homer notices a rare gummy candy stuck to the rear of the babysitter's skirt and reaches for it, and the gesture is misinterpreted. The accusation that follows destroys Homer's reputation, consumes the family's life, and places Homer in a position of nearly complete institutional helplessness against a media narrative that has determined his guilt before any evidence has been examined. The specific cultural context the episode was responding to was the wave of sexual harassment accusations and litigation that had become a significant feature of American public life in the early 1990s. The Anita Hill hearings in 1991 had brought the subject of workplace sexual harassment to a national audience in an unusually direct and sustained way. The legal and professional landscape was shifting in ways that were genuinely complex, creating important new protections for people who had been harassed, while also creating the possibility of false accusations that could devastate people's lives before due process could function. Homer Badman was written by Greg Daniels, who would go on to create the American version of The Office and Parks and Recreation. The episode is one of the finest individual pieces of work from the show's classic period, in part because it holds a difficult tension without collapsing it. The episode takes the false accusations seriously as a harm. It depicts Homer's helplessness with genuine empathy. It shows how media narratives can create a reality that supplants the actual facts. At the same time, the episode is explicit that sexual harassment is real, that the institutions that exist to address it serve a genuine purpose, and that Homer's false accusation does not delegitimize the category of genuine harassment. This balance was unusual and required a specific kind of craft to maintain. The easy version of this episode writes itself as a simple, false accusation is bad, story that implicitly undermines the broader project of taking harassment seriously. The version Greg Daniels wrote doesn't do that. It maintains throughout the understanding that the problem Homer faces is not that sexual harassment is taken seriously, but that the specific mechanisms by which it's addressed, the media coverage, the institutional responses, the court of public opinion can function in ways that are unjust to specific individuals without that injustice invalidating the broader project. The episode's satire of media coverage is the element that has aged most interestingly. The fictional news program that becomes obsessed with Homer's case, that creates a narrative of his guilt and sustains it across multiple broadcasts, that interviews people who have no actual knowledge of the incident, but who speak with authority about Homer's character. This was recognizable in 1994 as a satire of specific tendencies in tabloid television. In the decades since, those tendencies have migrated from tabloid television to the internet and social media, and the dynamics the episode depicted have intensified rather than diminished. The episode includes a remarkable scene in which Homer, trying to respond to the accusations against him, is interviewed by a documentary filmmaker and produces footage that he believes will clear his name. The footage is then edited in ways that invert his actual statements, turning his claims of innocence into apparent admissions of guilt. The documentary filmmaker's manipulation of the interview footage is presented as both funny and genuinely alarming, a demonstration of how the selective editing of real events can produce a completely false picture of what happened. This scene landed differently in 1994 than it does now, partly because the specific techniques it depicts clip and remove context, juxtapose statements from different moments to create false sequences, use cutaway shots to suggest reactions that didn't occur in the context where they're placed, were primarily associated with tabloid television and documentary manipulation. The democratization of video editing tools and the rise of social media has made these techniques available to anyone with a smartphone and an agenda, and the dynamics the episode depicted as a specific form of media malpractice have become a general feature of information environments. The episode's resolution is unsatisfying in a way that the show clearly intends as a critique of the specific situation Homer is in, rather than as a narrative failure. The accusation is disproved not through due process or institutional fairness, but through pure luck. The babysitter has secretly filmed Homer's innocent gummy candy reach on a video camera she happened to have running, and the footage exonerates him. The luck is the point. The episode is suggesting that Homer's exoneration is the product of a fortuitous accident rather than the system working as it should, and that in the absence of the camera footage, the outcome would likely have been different. This ending generated some critical attention at the time, with a minority of reviewers arguing that the episode's resolution was too convenient, that it let the institutions that had failed Homer off the hook rather than forcing a confrontation with the systemic problems it had identified. The majority view was that the accidental nature of the exoneration was thematically intentional and that the episode's point was precisely the inadequacy of the mechanisms available to someone in Homer's position. Homer Badman was one of the first pieces of mainstream American entertainment to engage seriously with the specific phenomenon of media-driven reputational destruction in the context of sexual harassment accusations. The landscape it was mapping was not fully developed in 1994. The social media dynamics that would later make this kind of destruction faster and more complete were not yet present, but the underlying mechanisms it identified were real and were already producing outcomes that the episode accurately depicted. The episode's canonical status in discussions of the show's best work is well established. It demonstrates the kind of engagement with difficult real-world subjects that made The Simpsons more than a comedy. It made it, at its best, a form of social observation that used the specific tools of satire to say things that straightforward journalism or drama couldn't say, with the same efficiency or the same capacity to make an audience laugh and think simultaneously. It also demonstrates that the show's most effective engagements with real-world controversy were not the ones that generated protests or boycotts or diplomatic incidents, but the ones that took a complicated subject and trusted the audience to hold the complexity without resolution. Homer Badman does not tell you what to think about sexual harassment accusations. It tells you that the mechanisms that exist to address them can fail specific individuals in ways that are real and serious, and that this failure does not vindicate the impulse to dismiss the broader project. That's a difficult thing to say. The episode says it with grace. Section 10, Marge versus the Monorail, and Much Apu About Nothing, the episodes that triggered real political debates. The Simpsons has spent 36 years generating political debate about everything from nuclear energy policy to immigration to education funding. Two episodes in particular managed to insert themselves into actual policy debates in ways that went beyond the usual cultural commentary. They became reference points in real arguments between real people about real decisions, which is a different order of influence from generating think pieces. Marge versus the Monorail aired on the 14th of January 1993 during the 4th season. It was written by Conan O'Brien, who was a member of the writing staff before leaving to host Late Night, and it is frequently cited as one of the best individual episodes the show ever produced. The premise involves a fast-talking salesman named Lyle Lanley who convinces Springfield to spend its municipal windfall on a monorail, a flashy, impractical, oversold public transit project that turns out to be a disaster waiting to happen. The episode is a parody of The Music Man, the Harold Hill story about a con man who sells a band to a small Iowa town, and the parallel is both explicit and structurally important. Lanley is Harold Hill in Springfield. The monorail is the band. The town's susceptibility to the pitch is treated as a character flaw, a combination of civic vanity, desire for the modern, and susceptibility to a good performance that produces a disastrous outcome. What the episode didn't anticipate, and what its writers couldn't have planned for, was the way it would be adopted by critics of specific real-world monorail projects in the years following its broadcast. The episode became a standard reference in debates about proposed monorail systems in various American cities, deployed by opponents of these projects as a shorthand for the argument that monorails were inherently impractical, inherently the product of con-man salesmanship rather than genuine transit planning, and inherently likely to fail. This appropriation of the episode for specific political purposes created a complicated situation. The episode's satire is not actually a policy argument against monorails. Lyle Lanley is corrupt. He builds the monorail badly because he's skimming the construction budget. The episode is about civic gullibility and about the specific vulnerability of communities to charismatic salesmanship, not about the inherent merits or demerits of monorail technology. But the monorail meme that the episode generated was used in debates about real projects in ways that elided these distinctions, reducing a nuanced satire to a simple monorails are bad argument that the episode itself didn't make. The most prominent application of the episode's mythology to a real-world debate was in the ongoing controversy about Las Vegas's monorail, which opened in 2004 and has faced financial difficulties throughout its existence. Critics of the project have frequently invoked the Simpsons episode, sometimes as genuine analysis and sometimes as pure rhetorical shorthand. The episode's Lyle Lanley, memorably voiced by Phil Hartman in what turned out to be one of the last great Simpsons guest performances of the show's classic era, has become a cultural shorthand for a certain type of infrastructure oversell that is frequently invoked with the specific verbal cadence of the episode's songs. The writers of the episode have generally been amused by this appropriation while also noting its limitations as policy analysis. Conan O'Brien, discussing the episode in various interviews over the years, has maintained a combination of pride in the episode's cultural durability and gentle skepticism about the leap from cartoon satire to real-world infrastructure policy. Much Apu About Nothing, which aired on the 5th of May 1996, operated in different territory, but generated an equally direct connection to real policy debates. The episode involves Springfield implementing a ballot measure Proposition 24 that would deport illegal immigrants from the town, following a bear sighting that gets redirected, through a series of political maneuvers, into immigrant hysteria. Apu, the quick E-Mart owner who is a central recurring character, is revealed in the episode to be an undocumented immigrant who has been living and working in Springfield for years. The episode is explicitly about the scapegoating of immigrants as a response to community anxieties that have nothing to do with immigration. The bear that starts the episode's political chain reaction is real, but the political response to the bear, a bear patrol, followed by a tax increase to fund the bear patrol, followed by public outrage about the tax, followed by political redirection of that outrage toward immigrants, is a precise satirical model of how political manipulation of immigration sentiment works. The episode was produced in the specific context of California's Proposition 187, which had passed in 1994 and which sought to deny public services to undocumented immigrants. The debate around Proposition 187 was one of the defining political controversies of the mid-1990s in California and had significant resonance nationally. Much Apu About Nothing was clearly in dialogue with that debate, and the analogy between Springfield's Proposition 24 and California's Proposition 187 was not subtle. The episode generated debate on both sides of the immigration issue at the time of its broadcast. Viewers who opposed immigration restriction generally appreciated the episode's clear positioning of immigrant scapegoating as political manipulation. Viewers who supported the kinds of restrictions that Proposition 187 represented generally felt the episode was unfairly one-sided, that it characterized all support for immigration enforcement as irrational, panic-driven scapegoating, rather than engaging with the legitimate policy. Arguments on the restrictionist side. This debate has recurred, with increasing intensity, every time immigration policy becomes a major political issue, which has been frequently since 1996. The episode is periodically rediscovered and cited in immigration policy discussions. often by people who see the Springfield of 1996 as a precursor to political dynamics that have become more prominent and more intense in the decades since. The episode also represents a significant moment in the development of Apu as a character and in the show's relationship with its immigrant characters more broadly. Apu's status as an undocumented immigrant is presented sympathetically. The episode eventually arranges his legal status, and Apu becomes a citizen in a ceremony that is emotionally genuine, despite being comedically framed. The relationship between Apu's characterization in this episode and the subsequent controversy about Apu as a character, which we'll discuss in detail in the final section of this script, is complicated and worth noting. The episode made Apu's immigrant story the emotional center of a sophisticated piece of political satire. The controversy that came later was about something different, about the nature of his representation as an Indian American character across the series as a whole. Both Marge versus the Monorail and Much Apu About Nothing demonstrate something specific about how the Simpsons' most politically engaged episodes function in the culture. They don't just comment on political debates. They become part of those debates, providing language and imagery and conceptual frameworks that participants in those debates then use sometimes appropriately and sometimes not to make their arguments. The show's characters and jokes migrate from entertainment into political discourse in ways that the writers couldn't have anticipated and can't control once the migration happens. This is both the show's greatest cultural achievement and its most complicated legacy. The reach of its influence means that its satire has real effects on real debates. But those real effects are mediated by the decisions of people who are using the show's imagery for their own purposes. And those purposes don't always align with the intentions of the writers who created the imagery in the first place. The monorail isn't actually an inherently bad form of public transit. The episode is about a corrupt contractor, not about monorails. But the Springfield monorail meme has been used to argue against actual transit projects in ways that use the episode's authority to make a policy argument the episode doesn't actually make. This is the risk of satire that works. It becomes a currency that circulates in contexts its creators never intended and sometimes can't endorse. Section 11. The Treehouse of Horror. Specials that brought Congress and parents groups to their televisions. Every year since 1990, The Simpsons has produced a special Halloween anthology episode called Treehouse of Horror. Each episode consists of 3 short horror-themed stories that operate outside the show's normal continuity. Characters die, impossible things happen, and the usual rules of Springfield's reality are suspended even further than they normally are. The specials have become one of the show's most beloved traditions and some of its most ambitious creative work. They have also, at various points in the show's history, generated controversy that reached beyond the usual territory of television criticism and into the realm of organized campaigns, parental advocacy, and in at least one instance, attention from members of the United States Congress. The early Treehouse of Horror episodes established a tone that was darker than American network television had generally permitted in a primetime animated format. The first special, which aired in 1990, contained stories involving a haunted house, an alien abduction, and a parody of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. None of these generated significant controversy, but they established that the show intended to take the horror premise seriously enough to actually be frightening as well as funny, a combination that the broadcast standards conventions of the time generally tried to prevent. By the mid-1990s, the specials had become more aggressive in their violence, their dark humor, and their willingness to engage with genuinely disturbing subject matter. Treehouse of Horror V, which aired in October 1994, is frequently cited as the special that pushed the furthest into territory that broadcast standards would have prevented in any other context. The special contains a segment called The Shinning, a parody of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, in which Homer goes homicidally insane and attempts to murder his family. The violence in the segment is cartoon violence, axes through walls, chases through a hedge maze, the particular brand of exaggerated physical comedy that animated formats use to signal that what you're watching is not real but it's also sustained, graphic by television standards of the time, and funny in a way that required the viewer to simultaneously appreciate the humor and acknowledge the darkness. The Treehouse of Horror specials generated their most significant organized controversy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when parental advocacy groups that had been focusing on television violence and its potential effects on children began paying more systematic attention to the special's content. The specific concern was that the specials aired in prime time, on a Sunday evening, at an hour when children were watching in significant numbers, and that the violence and horror content was not adequately distinguished from the regular programming that families had become comfortable allowing their children to watch. The Parents Television Council, which was the most organized and persistent of the advocacy groups monitoring primetime television content during this period, included Treehouse of Horror segments in its annual reports on television violence multiple times throughout the late 1990s and 2000s. The PTC's approach was to document specific instances of objectionable content, issue them to advertisers and to Congress, and argue that the combination of the content and its accessibility to children constituted a public harm that advertisers should not financially support. The congressional attention to television violence that accompanied the PTC's campaigns in this period was real and had real effects. The V-chip legislation, which required new televisions to include hardware capable of blocking content based on ratings, was passed in 1996 as part of the Telecommunications Act. The Simpsons and its Halloween specials were among the programs cited in congressional debates about children's television and violence, not as primary examples but as part of a broader discussion about the adequacy of the voluntary television rating system. The show's response to these concerns was consistent with its general approach to external pressure. It did not change the Treehouse of Horror content in response to advocacy group campaigns or congressional attention. The specials continued to develop in the direction of more elaborate, more visually ambitious, and in some respects more violent or disturbing content. The show took the position that the specials were clearly labeled as non-canonical special episodes, that they aired with appropriate content ratings, and that the V-chip technology that Congress had required to be installed in televisions gave parents the tools to prevent their children from watching content they found inappropriate. This position was consistent with the broader position that the television industry took in response to the PTC's campaigns. Voluntary content ratings plus parental control technology represented the appropriate regulatory response to concerns about children's exposure to violence and mature content, and mandatory government regulation of content would constitute a First Amendment violation that the industry would not accept. The debate around the Treehouse of Horror specials intersected with a broader conversation about The Simpsons' place in American culture and its relationship to children's entertainment. The show was, technically, a primetime animated series aimed at adults, but its animated format meant that children watched it in large numbers, and the show's content language, sexual references, violence was not calibrated for a child audience. The Treehouse of Horror specials intensified this tension by adding horror content to a show that was already navigating the gap between its animation format and its adult themes. One specific segment that generated particular controversy was from Treehouse of Horror 8, which aired in 1997. The segment Fly vs. Fly, a parody of the film The Fly, contains imagery that some viewers and advocacy groups found unusually graphic for an animated family-adjacent show. The specific complaint was about the depiction of body horror, the transformation of Bart's body in ways that were disturbing rather than simply funny, and about whether the combination of a child character and body horror imagery crossed a line that the show's usual approach to cartoon violence did not. The segment was not pulled. The episode aired in its original form. The complaints were registered and noted. This pattern complaint, acknowledgement, continuation was the standard cycle that the Treehouse of Horror specials generated throughout their run. What the specials actually accomplish, in their best moments, is something that the controversy around them sometimes obscures. They are among the most formally adventurous work the show has ever done. The anthology structure liberates the writers from the constraints of character continuity and story logic that apply to regular episodes. The stories can end with death, with catastrophe, with transformations that can't be walked back, because none of it counts in the regular timeline. This freedom has produced some of the show's most inventive and genuinely memorable storytelling. The Time and Punishment segment from Treehouse of Horror 5, in which Homer repeatedly attempts to travel to the past and accidentally creates increasingly wrong versions of the present, is a piece of pure comedic science fiction that rivals anything in the genre. The controversy around the specials is, in retrospect, more interesting as a document of late 90s anxieties about children's media than as a genuine reckoning with anything the show was doing wrong. The specials were doing exactly what they were advertised as doing, producing horror-themed Halloween entertainment with cartoon violence and dark humor for an audience that wanted that combination. The anxiety was about the audience, not the content, about the fact that children were watching something that wasn't made for them, in a time slot that implied broader accessibility. The specials have continued to evolve over the decades since the controversies of the late 90s. They've become more elaborate in their production values, more ambitious in their cultural references, more explicitly aware of the genre conventions they're playing with. They've also generated somewhat less organized controversy, partly because the advocacy landscape has changed and partly because the baseline for what's considered acceptable in primetime entertainment has shifted in ways that make the Treehouse of Horror specials look tame relative to what now airs at 10 p.m. on competing networks. The 30-year tradition of the specials is itself a remarkable piece of television history. No other long-running series has maintained an annual horror anthology format with the consistency and creative ambition that The Simpsons has brought to the Treehouse of Horror episodes. They remain, for many fans, the event that they most look forward to each season, the moment when the show frees itself from its own conventions and allows itself to do things that the regular format can't accommodate. The fact that they generated congressional attention and parental advocacy campaigns in their prime era is, in retrospect, a kind of validation. The things that scare people are usually the things that are doing something real. The specials scared the right people for mostly the wrong reasons, which is a pretty good description of effective horror comedy. Section 12. The Apu Controversy: How One Character Caused a Cultural Reckoning That Changed Television. The controversy around Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon is different in kind from every other scandal in this script. It is not about a single episode. It is not about a network decision or a foreign government's objections or a specific political debate. It is about a character who existed across more than 25 years of episodes, whose voice and whose representation became, in 2017, the focal point of a national conversation about race, representation, and the specific damage that can be done by caricature especially when the caricature is performed with genuine affection. Apu was introduced in the very early seasons of The Simpsons as the owner of the Quick E-Mart, Springfield's convenience store. He was voiced from the beginning by Hank Azaria, a white actor who performed the character with a strong Indian accent that was explicitly exaggerated, a caricature of Indian American speech patterns, of the kind that had appeared frequently in American comedy for decades. The character was funny. He was warm. He was kind and generous and loyal. He was shown across the years as a deeply committed member of the Springfield community, a man who had received an advanced degree from an elite institution, who was married with a large family, who had complex relationships with the Simpson family that included genuine friendship. He was also, for many South Asian Americans who grew up watching The Simpsons, a source of significant personal pain. The accent, the specific comic beats that depended on the foreignness of his speech and manner, the way the character's Indianness was deployed as a punchline in ways that the show's other ethnic characters' identities rarely were. The reality that "thank you, come again," Apu's catchphrase, was a phrase that South Asian American children heard quoted at them in mocking tones in school hallways and on playgrounds across America. This is not something that can be resolved by noting that Apu was a fully realized character, that he had humanity and depth, that the show treated him with evident affection. All of those things are true. They're also beside the point of what the criticism identified. The criticism was not about Apu's humanity within the show. It was about the effect of the character's most visible, most easily imitated, most frequently deployed elements on the lived experience of South Asian Americans in the real world. The comedian Hari Kondabolu made this argument with particular clarity and force in a 2017 documentary called The Problem with Apu. The documentary was not a polemic. It was thoughtful and nuanced and genuinely interested in the complexity of the situation. It was examining the fact that Apu existed as a character who was simultaneously harmful and beloved, that the harm was real and the love was also real, and that those two things could coexist without either canceling the other. Kondabolu's specific argument was not that Apu should never have existed or that the character was created with malicious intent. He acknowledged that the character emerged from a comedic tradition that had its own internal logic, and he acknowledged that many of the writers who developed Apu over the years were not consciously trying to harm South Asian Americans. His argument was about effect rather than intention, about what the character's most caricatured elements meant for the experience of a specific group of people who encountered those elements not just on screen, but in how they were treated by people who had internalized the character as a representative of their identity. The documentary featured interviews with numerous South Asian American actors, comedians, and public figures who spoke about their specific experiences with the Apu character and with the accent that Azaria performed. The accounts were consistent in their emotional specificity. This was not abstract complaint. These were people describing specific moments in their lives at school, at work, in social situations where the Apu imitation had been used as a form of mockery that they had to absorb. The show's initial response to the documentary was, to put it gently, not well received. In a season 29 episode that aired in April 2018, Lisa breaks the fourth wall and addresses the camera, acknowledging certain things that may be addressed at a later date if we feel like it. Marge adds that it's hard to say what the right answer is. The exchange was widely read as the show being dismissive about a serious criticism, using a meta-acknowledgement of the controversy as a way of signaling awareness without engaging with the substance of the concern. The backlash to the episode's response was significant and sustained. Critics who had been sympathetic to the show's general record on representation felt that the dismissive meta-joke was beneath the show's capacity for genuine engagement with difficult subjects. The contrast with episodes like Homer's Phobia, which had taken a difficult subject seriously and engaged with it honestly, made the response to the Apu controversy look like avoidance by comparison. Over the subsequent years, the situation developed in ways that felt less like resolution and more like accommodation to the specific pressure of changing cultural norms. Apu's appearances in the show became less frequent. His character had less screen time. The accent, which had been a defining feature of the character for over 25 years, became less prominent in the episodes where Apu did appear. Then, in 2020, Hank Azaria announced that he would no longer voice the character. His statement acknowledged the harm that the character had caused to South Asian Americans and expressed genuine remorse about his own role in perpetuating that harm. He noted that he had not fully understood the impact of what he was doing when he first began performing the role, and that the conversations he had had in the years following the documentary had significantly changed his understanding. Azaria later went further. He described reaching out to South Asian Americans, specifically to apologize to them personally, not as a public relations gesture, but as an attempt to genuinely reckon with the harm his performance had caused. He spoke publicly about his process of examining his own choices and his own responsibility within the specific dynamics that the documentary had identified. The Apu controversy had effects that extended beyond the character itself and beyond The Simpsons. It contributed to a broader conversation about the casting of animated roles, specifically about the tradition of white actors voicing characters of other races and ethnicities that eventually produced significant changes in how major animated productions approached casting decisions. Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, Central Park, and several other animated series made casting changes in the years following the Apu conversation, with white actors stepping down from roles that depicted characters of other ethnicities. The specific question of whether this change is the right approach to the broader problem of representation is genuinely complicated, and the arguments on multiple sides have validity. The argument for same-race casting in animation is rooted in the understanding that the labor of depicting a specific identity should belong to people who have the lived experience of that identity, that the expertise of representation is not just technical but personal and cultural. The counter-argument notes that acting is precisely the art of voicing experiences different from your own, that the same principle applied consistently would produce other results that many people would find counterproductive, and that the specific harm caused by certain caricatured performances is not primarily about the race of the performer, but about the nature of the performance. These arguments have not been resolved. They are ongoing in the entertainment industry and in the broader cultural conversation about representation and casting. What the Apu controversy did was make them unavoidable in ways they hadn't been before, by providing a specific, documented, extensively discussed example of how caricature performed with affection and maintained over decades could produce real harm that wasn't visible to the people producing it. The show has also grappled with the Apu situation in ways that go beyond the casting decision. The question of what to do with a character going forward, whether to recast him with a South Asian actor, whether to minimize his appearances, whether to retire him entirely, whether to explicitly address the character's complicated history within the narrative, has not been definitively resolved. Different approaches have been tried, and the show has not arrived at a clear and consistent position on how to handle the character who generated the controversy. This lack of clear resolution is itself instructive. The Apu controversy didn't have a clean ending because the underlying dynamics it exposed don't have clean solutions. The harm that was done was real. The affection that people also had for the character was real. The good intentions of many of the people who contributed to the character's creation and development were real. And the invisibility of the harm to the people causing it, which is perhaps the most important element of the entire story, was also real. The invisibility is where the most important lessons live. Hank Azaria has described not knowing what he didn't know, not understanding, when he was performing the character, that the accent was functioning in ways beyond the immediate comedy, that it was providing material for a kind of mockery that South Asian American children were experiencing in school hallways across America. This is not a defense of ignorance as a permanent condition, but it is an honest account of how harm can be perpetuated without malicious intent. The Simpsons was, at various points in its history, genuinely ahead of American culture on questions of representation and dignity. The fight over Homer's phobia, the sophistication of episodes like Much Apu About Nothing in their engagement with immigrant experience, the show's consistent satire of racism, of xenophobia, of the various American pathologies around identity and belonging. All of this was real, and it was part of what made the Apu controversy so complicated for people who had understood the show as one of the good ones, as a show that was on the right side of these questions. The Apu situation demonstrated that being generally progressive about representation doesn't immunize a production from perpetuating specific harms within its own content. Good intentions and accurate outcome are different things. The show meant well, in the most genuine sense of that phrase, and also caused harm. Both things were true simultaneously, which is perhaps the most adult and difficult lesson that the entire controversy offered. The character named after an Indian restaurant owner in the Satyajit Ray film, The Apu Trilogy, a beautiful series of films about a Bengali boy's passage from childhood to adulthood, ended up at the center of a controversy about how American entertainment depicts South Asian Americans. There is an irony in that origin that the character's creators probably didn't intend, and that the controversy's participants mostly didn't discuss. The name was chosen as a literary reference, an acknowledgement of a rich tradition of South Asian storytelling. The character who bore that name became, for many South Asian Americans, not a connection to that tradition, but a representation of how American entertainment flattened and caricatured their identity. The show has been on the air for 36 years. It has generated more public controversy, more cultural debate, more organized advocacy campaigns, more diplomatic incidents, more internal creative crises, and more genuine reckoning with questions about what comedy can and should do than perhaps any other television program in American history. The scandals in this script are not the show's failures. They are, many of them, the inevitable products of what the show was ambitious, topical, willing to push, operating at massive scale for a very long time. The show that pulled Stark Raving Dad in 2019 is the same show that fought Fox to air Homer's Phobia in 1997. The show that generated a diplomatic incident with Brazil is the same show that produced some of the most sophisticated immigration satire in American television. The show whose Apu character caused real harm to real people is the same show whose characters have made real people feel seen and valued and understood. That's The Simpsons. That's what 36 seasons of storytelling looks like when it's done by human beings who care deeply about what they're making and who are also, inevitably and without exception, capable of being wrong about things they don't yet know to question. Springfield is still there. The lights are still on. Homer is still stumbling through the door after another day at the plant. The scandals are part of the record, documented and examined and argued over in the same way that the show itself has always argued over the record with passion and specificity and a refusal to pretend that the comfortable version of the story is the true one. The comfortable version would be that the show got it right more often than it got it wrong, that its intentions were good, that the people who made it deserve the benefit of the doubt. All of that is true. The true version is more complicated than that. And the true version is also more interesting, and the true version is also, in the end, a better reflection of what the show has always been about. A family, a town, a record of what it looks like to try to be good in a world that makes being good complicated, and the specific, documented, thoroughly examined evidence of every time the attempt fell short. The show will never resolve all of this, neither will we, but it's worth staying up with, or sleeping through, or listening to in the dark with the lights off and the volume just loud enough to follow the story. Because the story is still going. And as long as it's going, there is always one more thing to say about Springfield. Sleep well. The town will still be there when you wake up. It always is. End of script. Total approximate word count. 50,000 plus words. Section 13. Bart gets an F. The episode that made America worry about its children. There is a category of Simpsons controversy that receives less attention than the protests and the diplomatic incidents and the network suppression battles, partly because it is quieter and partly because the concerns it raised were shared by enough people that organizing against them would have felt strange, like organizing against something everyone already basically agreed with. Bart Gets an F aired on October 11th, 1990, as the premiere episode of Season 2, and it generated a specific variety of cultural anxiety. The concern that a show built around a chronically underachieving child was glamorizing academic failure in ways that would affect how real children thought about their own academic performance. The episode is about Bart failing a history test and being given one final chance to pass it or be held back a year. The comedy and the emotion of the episode exist in careful balance. The comedy comes from the specific ways that Bart sabotages his own study attempts, his inability to sustain attention, his susceptibility to distraction, the specific optimism that each new study session will somehow produce results different from all the previous ones. The emotion comes from a genuinely affecting revelation. Bart is not lazy in the simple sense of not caring. He is afraid. He is afraid of failing in a public way, in front of people who matter to him. And the comedy of his sabotage strategies is also, looked at from a slightly different angle, the portrait of a child who cannot manage his own fear of failure and so invites the failure on his own terms, on the schedule he chooses, as a way of maintaining some control over what will happen to him. The episode ends with Bart failing the test again by 1 point, sitting alone in the empty classroom after everyone else has gone, breaking down, and beginning to pray. He prays for a miracle. He prays for snow because snow would mean no school and one more day to study. And it snows. And the miracle gives Bart one more day, and he spends the day studying with genuine commitment, and he passes the makeup test by 1 point. And the episode's final scene is Bart and his teacher sharing a moment of genuine emotional connection as she acknowledges what he has accomplished. Critics and educators who engaged with the episode in the months following its broadcast generally responded to it positively, noting that the episode's emotional core was about the genuine difficulty of learning, and the genuine difficulty of learning, cost of academic fear, and that the portrait of Bart was not a celebration of academic failure but an honest examination of what failure looks like from the inside of the person experiencing it. But the broader cultural conversation around Bart Simpson and academic achievement was less nuanced, and the episode existed in the context of a character who had become, in the public imagination, a mascot for a variety of irreverence and dismissal of authority that some educators and parents found genuinely concerning. The underachiever and proud of it, Bart Simpson t-shirt, which had become enormously popular in the period just before Season 2 premiered, was banned in several school districts across the United States in 1990 and 1991. The specific concern was that the shirt's slogan, and by extension, the character of Bart as he had been received in popular culture, was modeling for children an attitude toward academic achievement that was antithetical to what schools were trying to cultivate. Some principals issued formal statements. Some school boards voted. The controversy was real and was covered in local newspapers across the country. The Simpsons responded to this controversy in the way it typically responded to external criticism of its content, by making another episode. The show's approach to the "Bart is a bad influence" argument was to continue depicting Bart as exactly who he was, a complicated kid whose irreverence was one genuine feature of his personality among several other. Genuine features that included loyalty, creativity, a genuine moral sense that was often obscured by his behavior, and a capacity for the kind of emotional honesty that adults frequently lose because their social skills catch up with their feelings. The show was making a portrait, not a recommendation, and it maintained that position regardless of how many school boards passed resolutions about t-shirts. What makes the episode significant in retrospect is the precision of its emotional insight into what it feels like to be an underachieving child. The show was doing something in Bart Gets an F that children's programming at the time almost never did. It was being honest about failure in a way that didn't immediately resolve into a lesson, that didn't jump from the failure to the triumph without spending real time in the specific misery of falling short. The conversation that resulted about what children's entertainment should be doing, about whether it was appropriate to depict a child failing and feeling genuinely bad about failing rather than quickly learning and improving was, in retrospect, the right conversation to be having. It just wasn't being had in the most productive terms. The t-shirt controversy eventually faded, as these controversies do, absorbed into the larger conversation about what The Simpsons was and what it was for. The episode remains one of the show's most affecting early achievements, and its portrait of Bart as someone whose failures come from fear rather than from indifference has shaped how subsequent seasons continued to develop the character. Section 14. Homer the Heretic, God, Faith, and the episode that made churches uncomfortable. There is a very specific kind of religious discomfort that isn't quite outrage and isn't quite acceptance, a kind of squirming recognition that something is being said about faith that is too accurate to simply dismiss, but too challenging to simply embrace. Homer the Heretic, which aired on the 8th of October 1992, produced this kind of discomfort in religious communities across the spectrum of American Christianity, and it produced it precisely because the episode was genuinely thoughtful about religion in ways that made it harder to dismiss than a straightforward satire would have been. The episode begins with Homer deciding not to go to church, and finding, to his genuine surprise, that skipping church is one of the most enjoyable experiences of his adult life. He sleeps in, he watches football, he cooks his own waffle, he dances in his underwear. He has, in the episode's terms, a genuinely wonderful morning of the kind that he is almost never permitted to have. And when his family returns from church, freezing and miserable from a particularly unpleasant service, Homer feels not guilty but confirmed in his sense that staying home was the right choice, and confirmed in a more uncomfortable question that the episode is genuinely going to explore. Why should he go to church at all? The episode takes this question seriously. It does not present Homer's heresy as obviously wrong. It presents it as a genuine question deserving a genuine answer, and it allows the answer to emerge through Homer's experience rather than through a lecture. Homer has a dream in which God speaks to him, an actual conversation with the divine, rendered with the specific absurdism that the show brought to theological content, while never quite tipping into the dismissiveness that would have made the conversation merely a joke. God in Homer's dream is direct and conversational and strangely practical. He acknowledges that the church Homer has been attending may not be the right one for him. He is, in certain respects, on Homer's side. What the episode is doing, underneath the comedy and the dream sequences and the specific absurdity of Homer's relationship with organized religion, is engaging with a genuine theological question: the relationship between institutional religion and personal faith, and whether the institution is necessary for the faith to be real or valid. This is not a frivolous question. It is one of the central questions of American religious history, worked out across centuries of denominational dispute and spiritual experimentation, and the very American tendency to believe that the authentic religious experience is available directly, without the mediation of priests or buildings or fixed liturgies. Homer's heresy is, in this light, a very American heresy. He is not rejecting God. He is rejecting the specific form of God's house and God's schedule and the particular social obligations that come with a specific congregation in a specific building on a specific morning. This is a position that a genuinely large portion of the American population has occupied at various points in their religious lives, and the episode's comedy works partly because the recognition is immediate and broad. The response from religious organizations was mixed in ways that reflected the episode's own complexity. Some congregations objected to the episode's suggestion that an individual could maintain a valid relationship with God while rejecting institutional religion. Some found the dream sequence in which God speaks directly to Homer theologically presumptuous or inappropriate. Some found the episode's resolution, in which Homer is literally saved from a fire by his neighbors of various faiths working together, to be an implicit endorsement of the kind of practical religious community that Homer had been avoiding. What none of the religious critics could quite say, without undermining their own complaint, was that the episode was dismissive of religion. It wasn't. The episode takes faith seriously, takes the question of how people find meaning in their relationship with the divine seriously, and takes the specific failures of institutional religion seriously in ways that most popular entertainment did not. The discomfort the episode generated was not the discomfort of being attacked by someone who doesn't understand you. It was the discomfort of being examined by someone who understands you rather well. The episode's most lasting contribution to the show's mythology is also its most theologically interesting. The God depicted in Homer's dream is the only representation of God in the show's canon that is treated as potentially real, rather than as clearly hallucinatory or clearly metaphorical. The show would return to Homer's relationship with God in subsequent episodes, and the conversation in Homer the Heretic, the one in which God tells Homer that his time is not yet, that the mystery of life will be revealed to him, but not yet, became retroactively significant under the coma theory that we discussed in the introduction to this series. God telling Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma episode gives the theology here a weight that the episode itself doesn't fully carry, but that the accumulated mythology of the show confers on it. Section 15. The Do the Bartman Controversy and Michael Jackson's Hidden Songwriting. Since we have already spent considerable time with Michael Jackson's relationship with The Simpsons in the context of Stark Raving Dad, it is worth pausing on a separate dimension of that relationship that generated its own smaller controversy in the years following the episode's original broadcast. Do the Bartman, the single that was released in conjunction with Season 3, and that became a significant commercial hit in multiple countries, was widely understood at the time of its release to have been written and produced by Michael Jackson. This understanding was not publicly confirmed for several years. The single was released in 1990, before Stark Raving Dad aired, and it became one of the more successful novelty singles in memory, reaching #1 in the United Kingdom and Australia, generating significant airplay and commercial attention in the United States, and serving as a piece of commercial promotion for the show at a moment when the show's cultural profile was enormous. The musical production was sophisticated by the standards of novelty pop singles. The vocal performances were charming, and the songwriting credit listed 2 names that were not Michael Jackson. Jackson's involvement was not publicly confirmed until years later, and the confirmation came from Jackson himself in interviews and from the show's producers in retrospective accounts. The songwriting credits that had appeared on the single were not entirely fictitious. The credited writers had contributed to the song's development, but Jackson's creative contribution to the writing and production was significant and had been deliberately obscured, partly for the same reasons that his involvement in Stark Raving Dad had been obscured. He wanted to participate in The Simpsons' cultural moment in ways that allowed him creative freedom without the specific weight of his name and celebrity defining the terms of his participation. The controversy around the credits, when it eventually became a topic of discussion, was relatively minor in scale, a question of music industry credit attribution rather than a public scandal. The more interesting dimension was what it revealed about the specific nature of Jackson's relationship with the show, not the relationship of a celebrity doing a cameo and collecting a fee, but the relationship of someone who was genuinely invested in the creative work, who wanted to contribute substantially to it, and who was willing to do so in ways that kept his contribution invisible. This pattern, significant creative investment, combined with deliberate anonymity, was itself a form of the episode's central concern about celebrity identity, about the relationship between public persona and private engagement, about what it means to participate in something when you are too famous to participate in anything without your fame becoming the thing being participated in. Section 16. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge. The brilliant episode about censorship that was itself censored. There is a particular pleasure in finding that an episode of television about censorship has itself been a target of censorship. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, which aired on the 20th of December 1990, is an episode about what happens when a parent objects to violent cartoon content and organizes a campaign to have it removed from television. The episode takes this premise and follows it to its logical conclusions with a rigor and a fairness that is unusual in television's treatment of censorship debates. It takes both the concern about media violence and the concern about censorship seriously, does not resolve the tension between them into a simple answer, and ends in a place that leaves everyone, including the audience, with something to think about. The immediate context for the episode was the ongoing and intensifying public debate about violence in children's television that would eventually produce the V-chip legislation and the television content rating system. The debate was real, and the concerns that animated it were real. Studies on children's television had documented levels of violence that genuinely surprised many parents and educators who hadn't been systematically measuring what was in the programming their children were watching. The specific concern that violent cartoon content might be affecting children's attitudes toward violence and conflict was not the kind of concern that could be dismissed as purely irrational, even if the specific causal claims were contested. Marge's campaign in the episode begins as a response to Maggie hitting Homer over the head with a mallet after watching Itchy and Scratchy, the show's ultra-violent cartoon within a cartoon, which parodies Tom and Jerry and similar classic cartoons with a sustained extremity that makes the parody's point on its own, without any additional commentary. Marge concludes that Maggie's behavior is a direct result of the cartoon content, organizes a campaign against the show, and eventually succeeds in convincing the network to tone down the violence. What happens next is the episode's most interesting move. The toned-down Itchy and Scratchy, now featuring the characters engaging in peaceful, pleasant activities, is boring. It is also, within the episode's logic, effective. Children across Springfield, having lost interest in the cartoon they had been watching obsessively, go outside and play and rediscover the genuine pleasures of unmediated experience. For a brief and peaceful interlude, Springfield's children are living richer, fuller, more physically engaged lives than they had been. Then the campaign to clean up television extends to include Michelangelo's David, on display at the Springfield Museum, and Marge finds herself unable to endorse the logic she has just successfully applied to Itchy and Scratchy in this new context. The nudity in Michelangelo's David is artistic, not prurient. The violence in Itchy and Scratchy is gratuitous, not artistic. But the mechanism being applied is the same mechanism, and Marge's endorsement of censorship in one context makes it difficult for her to object to censorship in another context without explaining the distinction. She is drawing a distinction that turns out to be harder to articulate clearly than she had assumed. The episode does not resolve this tension into a lesson. Marge's position is shown to be inconsistent, but the inconsistency is presented as genuine moral complexity rather than as simple hypocrisy. There is a real distinction between gratuitous cartoon violence and a Renaissance masterpiece, and the episode acknowledges that the distinction is real, while also acknowledging that articulating it in terms that allow principled action is harder than it looks. The episode generated controversy from both directions, which is usually the signature of an episode that has engaged honestly with a genuine dilemma. Advocates for reducing television violence found that the episode was mocking their concerns by presenting the campaign as an overreach into art censorship. Advocates for artistic freedom found that the episode was too sympathetic to Marge's initial campaign, presenting the case for concern about media violence with more generosity than they felt it deserved. The show's response to both sets of complaints was the same response it always gave to critics who felt it was being unfair to their position. It was showing both sides, and what felt like unfairness to either side was the necessary product of genuine engagement with a real dilemma. The episode has since become one of the show's most cited in discussions of media literacy, censorship, and the genuine difficulty of distinguishing legitimate criticism of media content from illegitimate calls for censorship. It is taught in media studies courses. It is cited in journalism and in legal scholarship on First Amendment questions. It has aged into exactly what it was designed to be: a sophisticated engagement with a real problem that takes the problem seriously without pretending the solution is obvious. Section 17. Burns Air and Who Shot Mr. Burns? The Real Power Behind Springfield Scandals. The two-part Who Shot Mr. Burns? storyline, which aired at the end of Season 6 and the beginning of Season 7 in 1995, was not primarily controversial in the conventional sense. It did not generate diplomatic protests or congressional attention or network suppression. What it generated was something rarer and more interesting: a genuine national puzzle that engaged the American public in a way that fiction rarely does, and that revealed, in the process of its resolution, something about the relationship between storytelling and the audience that the show had built over 6 seasons. The storyline was built on a premise that had never been attempted by an animated show, a genuine summer cliffhanger mystery designed so carefully that the show's creators invited viewers to guess the shooter in a national contest. Fox promoted it with the energy of a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special. The summer of 1995 was, in its specific entertainment media landscape, genuinely organized around a question about a cartoon character. What made the promotion work was the foundation of 6 seasons of storytelling about Mr. Burns, the specific gravity of the character, the specific weight of his crimes against Springfield and its residents, the specific pleasure of seeing a figure of concentrated institutional power face a reckoning of some kind. Burns had stolen oil from under Springfield Elementary, ruined businesses, destroyed the retirement home, blocked out the sun. The shooting wasn't random violence against an innocent victim. It was a story about the consequences of unchecked power, told with the specific rhythm of the show's accumulated understanding of who Burns was and what he had done. The resolution revealing Maggie Simpson as the shooter, with an account of how the gun ended up in her hands through a parking lot encounter over a lollipop-generated debate that has never fully stopped. The debate was not about whether the answer was good or bad television, but about whether the answer was the right answer given the evidence available in the first part. The contest that Fox had organized specifically to solve the mystery produced, by the show's own account, essentially no correct guesses. Either the clues were insufficient to support the answer, or the answer didn't follow logically from the clues. What the storyline and its aftermath revealed about the show's relationship with its audience was something that had been building across 6 seasons of careful storytelling. The audience had developed a sophisticated engagement with the show's continuity and its character logic, and the terms of that engagement were ones the show was now managing in real time. The "Who Shot Mr. Burns?" mystery invited the audience to participate in the narrative in a specific way, and the resolution of that invitation affected what the audience understood the show to be doing with them. This dynamic, the relationship between the show's storytelling and the audience's investment in it, and the specific responsibilities that relationship creates, is one of the most important and least explicitly discussed dimensions of The Simpsons as a cultural phenomenon. The show built a specific kind of audience, attentive and engaged in specific ways, and the decisions the show made about how to honor or disappoint that engagement had consequences that played out over decades. Burns survived the shooting. Springfield continued under his influence. The power dynamic that made the mystery possible was not resolved by the mystery's solution, and the character who supposedly shot the most powerful man in Springfield was a baby who could not be prosecuted, which meant that the shooting, in some important structural sense, changed nothing. Maybe that was the point. Section 18. The seemingly never-ending story and the late-period ambition. There is a version of the Simpsons controversy story that ends around Season 10, roughly at the point where the most devoted fans of the classic era consider the show to have lost the specific quality that made it great. The scandals of the early and middle seasons, the fights with the network, the diplomatic incidents, the creative crises give way, in this telling, to a show that is coasting, that is generating controversy mostly through the accumulated weight of its continued existence, rather than through the specific provocation of its creative choices. This telling is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either. The later seasons of The Simpsons contain episodes of genuine ambition, genuine craft, and genuine emotional intelligence that get less credit than they deserve, partly because the context in which they appear, the long institutional tale of a show that peaked early and that has been living in the shadow of its own reputation for decades, makes it difficult to see them clearly. The seemingly never-ending story, from Season 17, is an episode constructed as an elaborate nested narrative, a story within a story within a story, each level revealing new information that retroactively changes the meaning of the levels above it. The structural ambition is considerable for any television show, let alone one that has been on the air for 17 years. The episode works. It is funny and clever and formally interesting, and it demonstrates that even in the show's later period, when the creative fires that had burned through the classic seasons had lowered somewhat, the show was still capable of doing something technically interesting. The controversy this episode represents is not a specific scandal but a broader and more diffuse one, the controversy of continued existence. The Simpsons' ongoing production, long past the point where most of its most devoted fans consider it to have been doing its best work, generates a kind of ambient controversy about what a show owes its own legacy and whether continued production of new episodes that are generally considered inferior to the classic period is a service to the show's audience or a disservice to the show's achievement. This is not a controversy with a clean resolution. The show has defenders who maintain that its later period contains underrated work, and the defense is not without basis. The show has critics who maintain that its continued production dilutes and damages the legacy of the classic period, and this criticism is also not without basis. The tension between these positions has animated fan discussion of the show for more than 2 decades, and it has not been resolved by the passage of time. What it represents in the history of Simpsons scandals is a kind of meta-controversy, a controversy not about any specific thing the show did, but about the show's relationship with its own history, about the obligations of a landmark piece of popular art to the standards it has set for itself, and about what it means to keep going after you have said the most important things you had to say. These are not small questions. The Simpsons has been living inside them for a long time, and it will continue to live inside them for as long as it continues to produce new episodes, which appears to be for the foreseeable future. Section 9:18. Homer's Enemy, the darkest episode ever made and why it terrified its own writers. Homer's Enemy, which aired on the 4th of May, 1997, during the 8th season, is an episode that its own writers have described, in various retrospective accounts, as deeply unsettling to make. Not because it was difficult to write in the craft sense, because what they were writing, once they understood what they were making, revealed something about Homer Simpson and about the show's relationship with its own main character that the comedy had always depended on obscuring. The episode introduces Frank Grimes, a man who has achieved everything he has through relentless hard work, personal sacrifice, and genuine competence in the face of adversity. Grimes is not a bad person. He is not a villain. He is, by almost any reasonable measure, a better person than Homer in almost every way that can be measured objectively. Harder working, more capable, more aware of the consequences of his actions, more grateful for what he has, more deserving of the recognition and reward that his life has not provided. He is hired at the nuclear power plant and becomes Homer's co-worker, and what he finds there destroys him. What Grimes discovers in Homer is an affront to the basic logic of the universe. Homer is lazy, incompetent, careless, and oblivious. Homer has a beautiful family and a house and a job he keeps despite 742 documented errors. Homer once went to space, which Grimes finds nearly incomprehensible. Homer's life, by any objective assessment, is far better than Frank Grimes's life, despite the fact that Homer has done almost nothing to deserve it while Grimes has worked his entire life to deserve everything and received far less. Grimes's spiral into obsession and eventual breakdown is played as comedy throughout the episode. The comedy of a man whose reasonable responses to an unreasonable situation escalate past the point where they remain reasonable. The specific comedy of someone whose logic is correct, but whose logic is being broken against an unreasonable world. And the episode's ending is genuinely dark in a way that is unusual for the show. Grimes, in his breakdown, imitates Homer's behavior, specifically Homer's habit of touching electrical wires without safety protection, and is electrocuted and killed. The episode ends at Grimes's funeral, where Homer falls asleep and begins murmuring about wanting a hot dog, and the assembled mourners laugh, and Grimes is dead, and the show treats this as a conclusion. The episode has been discussed by its writers as an attempt to answer a question that the show had never directly engaged with: what would happen if a normal, rational, competent person entered Homer's world and tried to apply normal human logic to it? The answer the episode finds is that normal human logic cannot coexist with Homer's world. The show's comic premise that an incompetent, careless, oblivious man can have a good life and keep it indefinitely through the specific structure of his universe is only sustainable if everyone in the universe has adapted to it. A person who has not adapted to it, who comes in from outside and tries to apply ordinary cause and effect reasoning, is destroyed by the encounter. The writer's discomfort with the episode came from recognizing that they had built a story that was, in some fundamental sense, about the darkness at the center of the show's premise. The comedy of Homer Simpson depends on the world conspiring to reward incompetence, to protect obliviousness, to allow consequences to perpetually not arrive. Frank Grimes is what consequences look like when they arrive. And they arrive not on Homer, they never arrive on Homer, but on the person who came in expecting them to. The episode is often cited as one of the finest the show ever produced, and also as one of the most disturbing, not in the horror sense, but in the sense of engaging honestly with something that the show's normal operations depended on leaving unexamined. The scandal it represents is internal, the scandal of a show recognizing the implications of its own premise and deciding to follow those implications to their conclusion, and then having to live with what the conclusion revealed. Section 20. Looking back over 36 years of beautiful trouble, we have spent this entire script in Springfield, and it is worth, before stepping fully away, taking a moment to consider what all of these stories add up to what they say, taken together, about the particular thing The Simpsons has been for the past 3.5 decades. The scandals are not incidental to what the show is. They are part of its nature, produced by the same instincts and commitments that produce the episodes themselves. A show with no scandals is a show that has never pushed hard enough against anything to generate friction. The Simpsons generated friction because it was pushing against network conventions, against social complacency, against the easy versions of stories that are always available as alternatives to the true versions. The friction was evidence of the pressure. Michael Jackson's episode was pulled because the people who made it took moral responsibility seriously enough to accept a genuine loss in service of a principle about harm and accountability. The Brazilian diplomatic incident happened because the show was willing to engage with political content about real countries rather than treating the world beyond America's borders as decorative background. The Chinese broadcast ban happened because the show was willing to say something about Tibet on Chinese television, which is a specific kind of courage in a specific kind of context. The Fox suppression of Homer's phobia was resisted because the showrunners believed the episode was worth fighting for, and they were right. The Apu reckoning happened because the show had been causing harm that it hadn't intended and didn't understand until someone explained it clearly enough and loudly enough that the explanation became impossible to ignore. All of these stories are about the specific difficulties of trying to say true things about the world in a form that millions of people will watch on a schedule managed by a commercial network with its own interests and constraints. The miracle is not that the show generated controversy. The miracle is that it generated as much that was genuinely good as it did, given those constraints, over that span of time. The characters are still there. Homer is still stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the power plant. Marge is still patient, still repressing things, still the structure that holds everything together through the specific competence of her love. Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8, Maggie is still watching everything from behind her pacifier, filing it away, waiting. The scandals are part of their story too. Every controversy the show generated was part of the record of what it was trying to do and how it tried to do it. The record includes the achievements and the failures and the fights and the accommodations and the moments of genuine courage and the moments of genuine error. That is what a record looks like. Sleep well. You have been in Springfield. It is a complicated place, full of radiation and love and corruption and loyalty and the specific, permanent, impossible beauty of a family that stays together through everything, that resets after every catastrophe, that always finds its way back to the couch by the end of the episode. The show will be there when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. Good night from Springfield. End of script. Section 21. The Simpsons and the Culture Wars. How a cartoon became a battleground. In the early 1990s, the phrase culture war was entering American public discourse with a frequency and urgency that suggested it was describing something real. A genuine conflict between different visions of American life, American values, and American identity that was being fought across multiple fronts simultaneously. Books and films and television shows and museum exhibitions and music were all, in this framing, sites of ideological contestation, rather than simply entertainment or art. The Simpsons arrived at the precise moment this framing was gaining traction, and it arrived as something that neither side of the supposed conflict could easily claim. Conservatives who might have been sympathetic to the show's occasional satire of liberal pieties found it impossible to embrace a program built on sympathy for a working-class family that the show depicted as the victim of corporate and institutional failures. Liberals who might have been sympathetic to the show's frequent mockery of greed, authority, and establishment hypocrisy found it difficult to fully embrace a program that was equally willing to lampoon the specific self-satisfactions of progressive culture. The Simpsons was not a culture war weapon that could be reliably pointed in one direction. It kept turning around in your hand. This quality, the refusal to be captured by any single ideological position, was one of the things that made the show so broadly appealing, and also one of the things that made specific episodes so prone to generating controversy from unexpected quarters. The episode that angered religious conservatives might be beloved by the secular left. The episode that angered immigration restrictionists might make immigration advocates uncomfortable for different reasons. The show's satirical compass pointed at hypocrisy and pretension, regardless of their ideological location, and the result was a show that had enemies everywhere and friends everywhere, and that could not be drafted into anyone's culture war without the show itself resisting the enlistment. The specific culture war controversy that attaches most directly to The Simpsons as a phenomenon, as opposed to any specific episode, involves President George H.W. Bush's famous The Simpsons moment, which occurred in January 1992 when Bush, campaigning for re-election, delivered a speech in which he expressed his desire for American families to be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. The remark was widely reported, widely discussed, and widely understood as an articulation of a specific vision of family values that was being advanced as a campaign theme. The show's response was characteristic and immediate. In the episode that aired the following Sunday, Bart Simpson watches Bush deliver the speech on television and says that the Simpsons family is just like the Waltons in both cases, he says. They're praying for the Depression to end. This is a joke that works on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface level, it's a joke about economic anxiety. On the satirical level, it's a deflation of the nostalgia that the Waltons comparison invoked. The Waltons were a Depression-era family, and the warm glow of nostalgia for their particular variety of family values tends to obscure the poverty and hardship that were also features of the era being romanticized. On the deepest level, it's a joke about how political appeals to family values work by invoking an idealized past that didn't exist quite the way the invocation suggests. The Bush remark and the Simpsons response became a minor cultural event that said something meaningful about where American political culture was at the turn of the decade. The President of the United States was using an animated family as a negative example of American values. The animated family's response was to compare themselves to the positive example the President had invoked in ways that deflated both the comparison and the values politics it was serving. The exchange was, in miniature, the specific dynamic that the culture war produced: the mobilization of cultural symbols in ideological service, followed by the symbols' resistance to that mobilization. The show continued to be cited in culture war discussions throughout the 1990s. Dan Quayle's remarks about Murphy Brown, another piece of television that was drafted into the values debate of the early 1990s, drew inevitable comparisons to Bush's Simpsons remark. The pattern of political figures using entertainment as a shorthand for cultural decline became a recognizable feature of the period's political rhetoric, and The Simpsons' specific combination of visibility and ideological elusiveness made it a particularly interesting case in that pattern. Section 22, Natural-Born Kissers and Marital Intimacy on Prime Time. The final episode of Season 9, Natural-Born Kissers, which aired on the 17th of May, 1998, generated a more specific and more domestic variety of controversy than most of the episodes we've discussed. The episode is about Homer and Marge rediscovering their physical attraction to each other after years of marital routine have made their intimacy feel obligatory rather than desired. The specific mechanism through which they rediscover this attraction, the excitement of nearly being caught in public, leads to a series of increasingly public and increasingly risky encounters that culminate in the two of them ending up naked in a stadium. The episode was pushing into territory that network primetime television had rarely visited in the specific terms that natural-born kissers used. The discussion of marital sexuality in a primetime comedy was not unprecedented, but the specific combination of the animated format, which gave the content a visual directness that live action would have needed to manage more carefully, and the show's family-friendly brand identity created a dissonance that some viewers found jarring. What made the episode worth the discomfort it generated was its genuine insight into the specific dynamics of long-term intimate partnership. The observation that desire in long partnerships often atrophies not because affection has diminished, but because familiarity has removed the uncertainty that is part of what generates desire. This is an observation that has a genuine basis in psychological research on relationships, and the show delivers it through comedy that feels true to the experience it's describing. Homer and Marge's problem is not that they don't love each other. It's that love and desire are not the same thing. And maintaining both in the specific conditions of a long marriage requires attention and creativity that routine does not encourage. The episode was also notable for its secondary plot, which involves Bart and Lisa finding an alternate ending to Casablanca in a farmer's field and being corrupted by the knowledge that the cultural artifact they had been taught to revere was capable of compromise and commercialism. This subplot is one of the funnier and more formally interesting things the show did in its middle seasons, a meditation on how we relate to cultural artifacts and what it means to discover that the versions of them we know are not the only versions that could have existed. The controversy around the episode was relatively contained. Some complaints about the appropriateness of the sexual content for a show that children watched, some discussion of whether the animated format made the content more or less acceptable than live-action equivalents would have been. But the episode's contribution to the show's exploration of Homer and Marge's marriage over the run of the series is significant. The show has returned repeatedly to the specific question of what keeps long partnerships vital and what threatens them. And Natural-Born Kissers is one of the more honest and more direct of those returns. Section 23. The Fat and the Furriest. When animal rights groups called. The Simpsons has depictions of animal mistreatment and hunting throughout its run that have generated complaints from animal rights organizations at various points in the show's history. The episodes that most directly attracted organized responses from these groups were those that depicted hunting and the specific dynamics around Homer's relationships with large animals, which have been a recurring source of comedy and occasional controversy. The Fat and the Furriest, from season 15, is an episode about Homer and a bear, and about Homer's response to being humiliated by the bear in a public setting. The episode is a parody of both nature documentary conventions and certain kinds of masculinity mythology, the idea that encountering and overcoming a dangerous animal is a test of a specific variety of manhood. The comedy comes from the collision between this mythology and the specific reality of Homer Simpson, who is not equipped for this mythology in any way and who approaches the encounter with the bear through the specific logic of someone who has watched too many films about what this kind of encounter is supposed to look like. Animal rights organizations objected to specific depictions in the episode that they felt normalized or glamorized negative treatment of bears. The show's response was consistent with its general approach to organized objections about content. It acknowledged the concerns without substantially modifying the episode or its distribution. What the bear controversies more broadly reveal about the show's relationship with animal content is actually quite interesting. The show has always been fond of animals. The Simpson family's dog, Santa's Little Helper, is one of the more genuinely affecting recurring characters in the show's cast, and the show's depictions of the family's relationships with various animals are usually sympathetic rather than cruel. The hunting episodes and the bear episodes represent a specific variety of comedy about human relationships with animal wildness that the show has explored repeatedly, and that has always generated some concern from viewers and organizations who feel the specific comedy normalizes attitudes toward animals that should be challenged rather than laughed at. This is a version of the broader satire is not endorsement debate that the show has participated in throughout its run. The comedy of Homer encountering a bear is not an endorsement of bear baiting, but the specific frame through which it's presented the masculine mythology of the man versus the wild animal does engage with attitudes that the comedy can either challenge or reinforce depending on exactly how it's handled, and the response of animal rights organizations to specific episodes suggests that the show has not always handled it in the way those organizations would prefer. Section 24. Sideshow Bob Roberts. The episode that predicted political consulting. There are specific Simpsons episodes that feel, watching them in retrospect, like they understood something about where American politics was going before American politics fully understood it itself. Sideshow Bob Roberts, which aired on the 9th of October 1994, during the 6th season, is the clearest example of this quality applied to electoral politics. The episode is about Sideshow Bob running for mayor of Springfield and winning through a combination of sophisticated political consulting, strategic use of negative campaigning, and what turns out to be voter fraud. The political consulting dimension of the episode is what makes it most interesting as a piece of political satire. The show depicts the specific mechanics of how a political campaign is managed, the polling, the focus groups, the creation of political advertising that is designed to produce emotional responses rather than convey accurate information, the manipulation of media coverage through the management of access, and the provision of compelling imagery with enough accuracy that the episode reads not as exaggeration, but as documentation. This was 1994. The specific consulting techniques the episode depicted were not new, but they were not yet as fully understood by the general public as they would become in subsequent decades, as the media's coverage of political campaigns became more sophisticated, and as books and documentaries about the consulting industry made its specific methods more widely understood. The episode was ahead of the cultural curve in depicting these methods in terms that a general audience could follow without specialized knowledge. The voter fraud element of the episode's sideshow, Bob's victory, is eventually attributed partly to votes cast by dead people and animated characters, is a piece of comedy that has taken on different resonances at different moments in American political history. At certain moments it reads as absurdist comedy. At other moments it reads as prescient commentary. The specific question of what kinds of electoral irregularity exist and how they affect outcomes is one that American political culture continues to argue about. And The Simpsons' 1994 treatment of it as a mechanism of political corruption is a reference point that people have reached for in various subsequent political contexts. The episode also contains one of the show's most memorable pure satire moments: the depiction of a talk radio host named Birch Barlow, who combines the specific rhetorical techniques of conservative talk radio, the exaggerated populist indignation, the deliberate elision of substantive argument, the entertainment-first approach to political commentary, with the specific personality of a media figure designed to generate heat rather than light. This was 1994, the year that the Republican revolution of the midterm elections was partially attributed to the influence of conservative talk radio, and the show's depiction of Birch Barlow was recognizable enough that it generated complaints from people who saw in it a specific lampoon of specific media figures. The show's consistent position on political commentary is that it lampoons the mechanisms and the rhetoric rather than specific individuals, and this episode maintains that position with enough consistency that the complaints were mostly unable to get traction. But the recognition was real, and the discomfort it generated in the people who recognized themselves in Birch Barlow was a specific kind of evidence that the satire was landing where it was aimed. Section 25. The end of the Springfield we knew, and what came after. The Springfield that exists in the 36th season of The Simpsons is different from the Springfield that existed in the second season, and the difference is not only in the quality of the animation or the sophistication of the cultural references or the specific comedy techniques the show has developed across decades of production. The difference is in what the show has been through, in the accumulated record of what it has done and what has been done to it, in the decisions made and unmade and argued over, in the controversies survived, and the reputations damaged and rebuilt, and in some cases permanently altered. The Apu who appears in recent episodes exists in the shadow of a controversy that has changed how the character is written and how the audience sees him. The episodes that deal with Michael Jackson's voice are no longer available on most platforms. The Brazil episode is still there but sits now in a different context than the one in which it was made. All of the episodes discussed in this script are part of a record that is permanent and public, and that colors the context in which every subsequent episode is received. This is what it means to have a history. Not just the good episodes and the Emmy Awards and the cultural impact and the way certain jokes have entered the language, but also the mistakes, the blind spots, the things that hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt, the things that were defended when they should have been reconsidered, the things that were reconsidered when they should have been defended. The show has been making this record for 36 years, and the record is what it is, not the version of it that the show's most passionate advocates want to tell, and not the version that its harshest critics want to tell, but the full version, which contains both the extraordinary achievement and the genuine failure, and which asks you to hold both at once without collapsing them into each other. Springfield was never a real place. It was always a construction a specific kind of American imaginary built from observation and exaggeration and genuine love for the specific textures of ordinary American life. But the things that happened to it were real, in the sense that the decisions made about the show were made by real people with real intentions who produced real effects in the world. The scandal about Apu affected real South Asian Americans. The decision to pull Stark Raving Dad was made by real people grappling with real questions about responsibility and harm. The fight to air Homer's phobia was won by real people who believed in real principles. Springfield is not on any map. It is everywhere and nowhere, as the geography episodes establish. But the show that was set there has a location in culture and in history that is as fixed and specific as any real place. It is the place where American popular entertainment spent 36 years trying to say true things about American life through the specific medium of a cartoon family whose children never age and whose father never learns and whose world resets after every catastrophe. The catastrophes were real, some of them. The resets were earned, most of them. And the attempt to tell the truth, the sustained 36-year, ongoing, imperfect, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harmful attempt to tell the truth is what we have been tracing through all these stories. We are done in Springfield for now. It was a long stay. It always is. The lights are still on. Homer is still at the plant. The family is still on the couch. The show is still going. And every story we've told tonight, every scandal and every fight and every diplomatic incident and every creative reckoning and every decision that had to be made and couldn't be unmade, every one of them is part of what makes Springfield the most extraordinary piece of real estate in American popular culture, a place that never existed, that contains more truth than most places that do. Good night. Total runtime: approximately 8 to 10 hours of narration. This script is written for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Extended deep dive. Section 1 revisited every layer of the Michael Jackson episode. The story of Stark Raving Dad does not end with the account of its removal, and there are several dimensions of what the episode represented and what its history revealed that deserve deeper exploration than a first pass allows. In particular, the episode's relationship to the specific mythology of Michael Jackson in 1991 and the way that mythology has changed in the 30-plus years since the episode was made is worth examining in detail, because that examination reveals something about how television works as a historical document and about the specific complications of trying to maintain a historical archive when the archive contains material whose meaning has changed. In September 1991, when Stark Raving Dad aired, Michael Jackson was at one of the highest points of his cultural ascendancy. Dangerous, the album he would release later that year, was one of the most anticipated records in years. His previous album, Bad, had produced 5 #1 singles. Thriller, the album before that, remained the best-selling album of all time and is still frequently cited as such. His concerts sold out in hours. His public appearances were global events. The specific combination of musical genius, visual extravagance, and personal mystique that Jackson had cultivated throughout the 1980s had produced a figure of celebrity whose scale was genuinely unusual, even in the context of the late 20th century's entertainment industry. The episode engaged with this mythology in ways that were intelligent and, at the time, felt fresh. The joke of having a character who sounded exactly like Michael Jackson, and who claimed to be Michael Jackson, worked because the Jackson mythology was a specific and recognizable construction that could be engaged with as a cultural artifact. Leon Kompowski's claim to be Michael Jackson was funny, partly because of the implausibility, the brick mason from New Jersey in a psychiatric facility, and partly because of the implausibility's specific contours. Michael Jackson was a person who had become a kind of idea about himself, a living icon whose public persona had migrated so far from ordinary personhood that the idea of him appearing in a psychiatric facility, or appearing anywhere that wasn't controlled and managed and mediated, was genuinely incongruous in a way that generated comedy. The episode was also, as we noted earlier, self-aware about this. The premise of Leon says he's Michael Jackson is already a meditation on celebrity identity, on the gap between the public figure and the private person, on what it means to wear a famous person's name and voice as a form of performance, on whether the performance and the reality are meaningfully distinct, and the episode never resolves these questions cleanly. Leon might be Michael Jackson, Or he might be a man who has found in Michael Jackson's persona a freedom and joy that his ordinary life as a brick mason doesn't provide. The ambiguity is the point. What nobody involved in making the episode was thinking about in 1991 was the possibility that the Jackson mythology would need to be reassessed in ways that would change the meaning of what they were doing. The first formal allegations against Jackson emerged in 1993, 2 years after the episode aired, when Jordan Chandler and his family accused Jackson of molesting the boy. The subsequent legal process, the settlement, the shifting of public perception, the criminal trial in 2005, and the acquittal, all of this was in the future when Stark Raving Dad was produced. And the episode bears none of the specific weight of that history, because it was made before the history happened. This is one of the central complications of maintaining a historical archive of popular entertainment. The archive is static. The context is not. The episode means one thing in 1991 and something more complicated in 2019. The specific thing it means in 2019, and the specific difficulty of that meaning for the people who made it and who loved it, is connected to the way the episode engaged with Jackson's persona rather than with Jackson as a private individual. The episode was in love with the idea of Michael Jackson. The question that the documentary raised was about what Michael Jackson had actually been doing with the children who loved the idea of him. The episode's warmth and its humanity are still real. The birthday song is still moving. The comedy of Leon Kompowski in the psychiatric facility is still funny. None of this has been retroactively deleted by what the documentary alleged. But the specific pleasure of the episode's engagement with the Jackson persona, the pleasure of having him there, in Springfield, in the room with Homer, making something small and beautiful is complicated now in ways that it was not complicated before, because what the documentary alleged is specifically about the children who had access to the private Jackson behind the public persona. And the episode's engagement with that persona was always also an engagement with what it meant for those children to have had that access. The removal does not resolve these complications. The complications exist regardless of whether the episode is in circulation. What the removal does is remove the specific pleasure of the episode from regular, casual, unmediated access, the pleasure of coming across it in a syndication cycle and watching it again, or of sharing it with someone who hasn't seen it, or of returning to it as a reference point in conversations about the show's best work. The complications are not made lighter by the removal. They are made harder to encounter, which is a different thing. This distinction between resolving a problem and removing the occasion for confronting the problem is one that has implications beyond this specific episode. The culture-wide conversation about what to do with art made by or prominently featuring people who have been credibly accused of serious harm has produced a range of responses, from full removal to full preservation to various intermediate positions that try to maintain access while also maintaining transparency about the relevant context. None of these responses is entirely satisfying. All of them involve trade-offs between different values that cannot be made commensurable. The Simpsons chose removal. The choice was made by people who had genuine authority over the episode and who made the choice for reasons they articulated clearly. It was not an impulsive choice or a cowardly one. It was a considered choice made in the context of specific allegations about specific harm to specific people. And the episode is gone. And Happy Birthday Lisa is still out there, in whatever form it exists in, and it is still beautiful, and the birthday it was written for is still worth celebrating even now. Extended analysis. The Fox network's relationship with The Simpsons, a study in creative authority. One of the less discussed dimensions of the various scandals The Simpsons has generated is the specific nature of the show's relationship with Fox, the network that has broadcast it since 1989. This relationship has been the subject of various forms of creative conflict over the decades, and the dynamics of those conflicts, who had authority over what, how disputes were resolved, what the limits of network intervention were, are relevant to understanding several of the specific scandals we've discussed. The relationship between a television show and its network is always a negotiation between creative authority and commercial interest. Networks hold the broadcast license, manage the advertising relationships, set the scheduling, and have various contractual mechanisms for influencing the content of what they broadcast. Show creators and production companies hold the intellectual property, have the creative expertise, and in some cases have sufficient institutional standing to push back against network interference with unusual effectiveness. The Simpsons occupied an unusual position in this negotiation throughout its run. By the mid-1990s, The show was so commercially valuable to Fox, so central to the network's identity, so reliable in its ratings, performance, so important to the relationships with advertisers that the network depended on, that the creative team had leverage that few other shows enjoyed. Fox could not easily afford to damage its relationship with the production company or the showrunners by forcing creative decisions that the show's creators found unacceptable, because the damage that a public conflict over creative authority would do to the show's reputation was also damage to Fox's reputation and to the commercial value of the property the network was broadcasting. This leverage is what made possible the successful resistance to the Homer's phobia suppression. The showrunners were able to push back against the network's decision to keep the episode off the air, partly because they had the institutional standing to make the threat of public disclosure credible if Fox suppressed a completed episode of the most valuable show on its network. Without the showrunners' agreement, the story of that suppression was itself a story that could be told and that could damage Fox more than airing the episode. The network had commercial incentives to reach an accommodation. The specific history of Fox's interventions in the show's content is incompletely documented in public sources, and the accounts that exist are sometimes contradictory or clearly shaped by the specific interests of the person telling the story. What is clear is that the network's relationship with the show's creative team was generally one in which the show's exceptional commercial value gave the creative team more protection from network interference than most shows enjoyed. This protection was not absolute. The network made decisions about scheduling, about the content rating labels applied to episodes, about the time slots in which the show aired, about the structure of the syndication deals that determined how the show was distributed after its initial run. All of these decisions had implications for the show's content and reach, and all of them were made by the network rather than by the show's creative team. The protection that the show's commercial value provided was protection against direct interference with specific creative choices. It was not protection against the various indirect ways in which commercial and institutional context shapes what a show can and cannot do. The relationship evolved as the show's commercial value changed. In the early seasons, when the show was still establishing itself and when Fox was still establishing itself as a network, both parties had more to prove and the relationship involved more active negotiation. By the middle seasons, when the show was at the peak of both its creative achievement and its commercial performance, the relationship had settled into something more like mutual benefit. Fox got an extraordinarily valuable show. The show got an unusual degree of creative latitude for a network broadcast series. In the later seasons, as the show's ratings moderated and as the media landscape changed in ways that affected the specific dynamics of network television, the relationship continued to evolve in ways that the public record doesn't fully document. What the various scandals we've discussed reveal about this relationship is that the creative authority the show's team exercised was genuine and significant, but that it was always exercised within a context defined by a commercial relationship that imposed real constraints. The show that fought Fox to air Homer's Phobia was also a show whose continued commercial success depended on maintaining a relationship with Fox that was workable. The showrunners' willingness to push back against the network was partly a function of their genuine creative conviction, and partly a function of their knowledge that they had leverage to push back with. The specific legacy of this relationship in the scandals we've examined is the understanding that the creative authority that made the show's best work possible was not a given. It was negotiated, maintained, and sometimes fought for, and the fact that the show generally won those fights over its creative direction is not evidence that the fights were easy or that the outcome was ever fully predetermined. Extended section. When the Internet found Springfield. The emergence of the Internet as a mass medium in the mid to late 1990s transformed The Simpsons' relationship with its audience in ways that had significant implications for the show's cultural position and for how its various controversies were understood and discussed. The Usenet groups and early web forums devoted to The Simpsons were among the first examples of sustained online fan communities around a television show, and the specific culture they developed, the detailed episode documentation, the obsessive continuity tracking, the sophisticated discussions of the show's thematic content and satirical targets shaped the way the show was received and discussed in ways that extended far beyond the communities themselves. The fan communities that emerged around the show in the early internet era were unusually sophisticated relative to most television fan communities of the time. The show's specific quality of rewarding attentive viewing, the callbacks, the background sight gags, the dense network of internal references meant that the people most likely to seek out and participate in online discussions of the show were people who were already paying close attention to it, and the communities they created reinforced and amplified that attentiveness. The result was a fan culture that was more analytically sophisticated, more historically aware, and more capable of sophisticated critical engagement with the show than most television audiences. This sophistication had several effects on the show's scandals and controversies. The organized fan response to The Principal and the Pauper was partly possible because the online communities had created spaces where fans could coordinate their responses in ways that weren't available before. The documentation of continuity errors and character inconsistencies that made the Tamzarian revelation feel like a betrayal was partly the product of the close attentiveness that the online communities had been developing and refining for years. The fan communities had, in a sense, created the audience whose trust the episode violated. The internet also transformed how the show's predictions were understood and discussed. The Simpsons predicted this meme, the observation that various episodes had depicted things that later came true, would not have been possible without the internet's capacity to rapidly surface and circulate clips and screenshots from episodes that had aired years or decades earlier. The prediction phenomenon is, in this sense, partly a product of the specific affordances of internet culture, the searchability of the archive, the ease of sharing specific clips, the way the internet's attention economy rewards surprising coincidences and penalizes acknowledgments of the prediction failures that outnumber the hits. The fan communities also played a role in keeping certain controversies alive that might otherwise have faded more quickly. The ongoing discussion of the "Who shot Mr. Burns?" mystery, the examination of the evidence, the alternate theories, the arguments about whether the official answer was adequate to the evidence was sustained and amplified by the online communities in ways that kept the question present in the show's cultural reputation long after the episode had resolved it officially. The communities were doing something that most television audiences had never been able to do, maintaining an active, ongoing, searchable archive of discussion about specific episodes and specific creative decisions, an archive that anyone could consult at any point to find out what the sophisticated fan consensus was about any given question. This is part of what makes The Simpsons' relationship with the internet so interesting as a cultural phenomenon. The show arrived at the precise moment when the tools for this kind of sustained, detailed, community-based engagement with entertainment were becoming available, and the specific qualities that made the show worth such engagement, the density of the references, the consistency of the character logic, the ambition of the satirical project, made it one of the shows that most rewarded and most shaped the development of internet fan culture. The influence runs in both directions. The internet shaped how The Simpsons controversies were discussed and sustained. The Simpsons shaped how internet fan communities developed the specific vocabulary and analytical practices that would eventually be applied to every other major entertainment property that attracted devoted fan communities. The show and the medium grew up together in a specific and important period in the history of both. Closing meditation. 36 years of not looking away. There is a specific quality in the best long-form storytelling that has nothing to do with plot or character development or thematic consistency, and that is harder to name and harder to create than any of those things. It is the quality of sustained attention, the willingness to keep looking at something, to keep returning to it, to refuse the temptation of looking away when what you're looking at becomes difficult or complicated or embarrassing or sad. The Simpsons has been looking at America at the specific version of American life that it mapped onto Springfield and the Simpson family for 36 years. It has not always looked clearly. It has not always looked honestly. It has looked away at certain moments, and it has been forced by external pressure to look away at others, and it has sometimes looked at the wrong things for the wrong reasons. But the sustained attention itself, the commitment to staying in this specific imaginary place and continuing to find stories there, to continue asking what it means to be the kind of people these characters are in, the kind of world this world is something that few pieces of popular entertainment have managed at anything like this scale. The scandals we have traced through this script are all, in one way or another, the product of that sustained attention. When you look at something for long enough and honestly enough, you find things that are uncomfortable. You find the three-eyed fish in the water downstream from the nuclear plant. You find the brick mason from New Jersey who says he's Michael Jackson. You find the principal who isn't who he says he is. You find the baby who may or may not have shot the richest man in town. You find the immigrant who has been here for years and who is about to lose everything. You find the gay man who is funny and kind and generous, and whose existence makes your neighbor afraid. You find the country your characters just traveled to looking back at you with a government spokesperson asking for an apology. When you look for long enough, you also find your own blind spots. You find the character whose comedy depends on a caricature that has been causing real harm to real people for 25 years. You find the episode you made with a person who was doing terrible things that you didn't know about and would not have accepted if you had known. You find the places where your commitment to saying true things about the world was less consistent than you believed it was, and less comprehensive, and limited by the same blind spots that limit every human attempt to see clearly. The scandals are the places where the attention produced results that were painful or costly or wrong. But the scandals are also evidence that the attention was real, that the show was actually looking, actually trying, actually committed to the project of finding and saying something true about American life through the specific medium of an animated comedy that has been running for longer than most of its audience has been alive. That is not nothing. In the history of popular entertainment, it is actually something quite rare. Most entertainment looks away. Most entertainment smooths the difficult surfaces and delivers the comfortable version. The Simpsons, at its best, refuse to do that. And the scandals are the scars from the refusals. Springfield will keep the lights on for as long as Homer Simpson walks through that plant. The family will keep resetting after every catastrophe. The show will keep finding new ways to say the same true things, and new ways to say the wrong things, and new controversies to generate and survive. And we will keep watching. Because we have been watching for 36 years, and the loop won't break unless we let it, and we are not ready to let it. We pressed pause in 1989. We are still not ready to press play. Good night from Springfield. End of script, total duration. Approximately 9 to 11 hours narrated. Extended deep dive. Marge versus the monorail. How a song about infrastructure became a political flashpoint. There is an argument to be made that Marge versus the monorail, written by Conan O'Brien and broadcast on the 14th of January 1993, is the single most technically perfect episode The Simpsons ever produced. The argument is not fringe. Among the show's most devoted and analytically serious fans, the episode consistently ranks at or near the top of any comparative ranking, and the qualities that earn it that placement are reproducible on any given viewing. The density of the comedy, the precision of the satirical target, the structural elegance of the story, the specific pleasure of every musical beat in the monorail song, the way the episode manages to be simultaneously a parody of The Music Man, a critique of civic credulity, a referendum on the politics of infrastructure spending, and a straight-up absurdist comedy about a man selling a defective monorail to a town full of easily distracted voters. The political controversy the episode generated was quieter than the diplomatic incidents and the congressional hearings and the network suppression battles that other episodes produced. But it was real and it was specific. The episode was broadcast during a period of active and contentious national debate about infrastructure spending, about the role of federal investment in local transportation projects, and about the specific question of whether communities were being sold expensive, underperforming transit systems by vendors who prioritized salesmanship over delivery. The light rail and monorail debates of the late 1980s and early 1990s were not abstract policy discussions. They involved real municipalities, real vendors, real contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and real communities that were living with the consequences of transit decisions made in previous decades that had not delivered what they promised. The episode's specific satire, a fast-talking stranger rolls into town, sells the residents an expensive transit boondoggle with a song, and the town's pride in its shiny new project prevents anyone from asking whether the project was actually a good idea, was recognizable enough to the participants in real transit debates that it generated real responses. Transit planning professionals found the episode uncomfortably accurate. Advocates for light rail and other forms of public transit found it uncomfortably dismissive of their arguments. Political figures who had backed expensive transit projects found it uncomfortably close to the criticisms their opponents had been making. And the vendors of transit infrastructure found it, depending on their particular situation, either completely irrelevant to their specific circumstances or uncomfortably pointed. What made the episode durable as a piece of satire was the universality of its target. The specific mechanism it was, satirizing the combination of civic pride, susceptibility to a polished presentation, and the specific psychological comfort of believing you are finally doing something ambitious, is not unique to transit decisions. It is a feature of how democratic communities make expensive collective choices, and the episode's anatomy of that mechanism has proven applicable to contexts far beyond the specific infrastructure debate of 1993. The episode has been referenced in discussions of stadium deals, in discussions of tech industry boosterism, in discussions of any situation where a community is being asked to commit significant resources to something that has been sold primarily through enthusiasm rather than evidence. Conan O'Brien, who left the show shortly after writing this episode to take over late night, has spoken in various interviews about the specific craft that went into the monorail song and the episode's structure. The song is not just funny. It is constructed to make its satirical point through its own structure, the escalation, the community's increasingly enthusiastic response, the specific moment where the logic breaks and the joke exposes itself, and the way that exposure is immediately papered over by the next verse's momentum. The song teaches you how communities get sold things they shouldn't buy, and it does so by doing the selling in real time. The episode's most politically significant moment is smaller than the monorail song. It comes when the town meeting is deciding what to do with the $3 million from Burns's fine, and Marge's suggestion that they use the money to repair Main Street is shouted down with enthusiasm when Lyle Lanley arrives with his monorail pitch. The scene takes about 30 seconds. It does more to explain how public resources get misallocated than most textbooks on public finance manage in considerably more time. The crowd's preference for the exciting new thing over the unglamorous maintenance of existing infrastructure is presented without editorial comment, which makes the editorial comment more effective than a direct statement would have been. Extended deep dive. Bart sells his soul, the episode that took theology seriously. The most surprising thing about Bart Sells His Soul, which aired on the 8th of October 1995, during the 7th season, is that it works as theology. Not as a parody of theology, not as a satire of religious belief, but as a genuine exploration of what it means to have a soul, what that concept refers to, why it matters, and what it would feel like to be without it. The episode is also, naturally, very funny, but the comedy is built on a foundation of genuine philosophical engagement that gives the episode a weight unusual for a half-hour animated sitcom. The premise is straightforward in the Simpsons fashion. Bart, in a display of adolescent, performative skepticism, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. He does not believe the transaction means anything. He cannot prove it means anything. And the episode does not try to prove it means anything through conventional theological mechanics. There are no demons arriving to collect the contract, no angels expressing concern, no divine intervention of the kind that would resolve the question by answering it. Instead, the episode explores what it feels like to be Bart without a soul through a series of small, precise observations. Automatic doors don't open for him. Animals don't respond to him with the instinctive trust they once showed. He looks at his reflection and sees nothing looking back. He cannot laugh spontaneously. He can do the mechanics of laughing but cannot produce the genuine article. These are not dramatic demonstrations of spiritual absence. They are quiet, specific experiences of disconnection from the world and from himself, and they accumulate into a picture of what having a soul actually means when you describe it in phenomenological rather than theological terms. A sense of connection to the living world, of being recognized by it, and of recognizing yourself within it. The episode generated the predictable response from religious communities. Some praise for taking the concept of the soul seriously in a way that most entertainment did not, some concern about the casual treatment of a sacred concept, some discomfort with the episode's resolution. Bart gets his soul back, but through Lisa's purchase of it from Comic Book Guy rather than through divine intervention, which makes the soul tradable and purchasable in ways that some found theologically problematic. What the episode's reception revealed was the specific difficulty of doing genuine theology in popular entertainment, the difficulty of taking a concept seriously enough to explore it honestly without either trivializing it through comedy or sacralizing it through reverence. The Simpsons navigated this difficulty in Bart Sells His Soul more successfully than almost any other popular entertainment has managed, partly because the show was willing to sit with the uncertainty rather than resolving it into a clear theological position. The episode ends with Bart sleeping, having recovered his soul, and having a dream in which he sees what he would have found if he had followed the river in the direction the dream self was going. All the children whose souls are around him are rowing boats, and Bart is stranded without one. The image is simple and affecting, and it says more about what a soul is than the theological literature that surrounds the concept manages to convey in considerably more words. It is the image of being alone while everyone else has a vehicle for moving through life, and the recognition that the vehicle is not something you can see or measure or trade, but that its absence is immediately and painfully apparent. Extended section. The Simpsons' depiction of mental health and the conversations it started. Among the various social topics that The Simpsons engaged with across its run, mental health is one of the most interesting and one of the most under-examined in discussions of the show's social impact. The show has depicted mental illness, mental health treatment, psychological crisis, and the specific dynamics of how individuals and communities understand and respond to psychological suffering throughout its history. And these depictions have generated both appreciation and criticism in ways that track the broader evolution of public understanding of mental health over the decades. The episode Stark Raving Dad itself contains a significant engagement with mental health themes in its depiction of the New Bedlam rest home for the emotionally interesting, the psychiatric facility where Homer is sent after appearing at work in a pink shirt and is evaluated through a personality test that is clearly inadequate for the purpose of diagnosing mental illness. The facility's name, the ease with which Homer is admitted, the randomness of the diagnostic process, and the general atmosphere of the institution are all elements of a satire of psychiatric institutionalization that was being offered to a mass audience in 1991. This satire had real reference points: the deinstitutionalization movement of the previous decades, the ongoing debates about the adequacy of the mental health system for people who needed sustained care, the specific ways in which psychiatric institutions had been sites of abuse and misuse rather than genuine treatment. All of these were part of the context in which the episode's satirical depiction of New Bedlam landed. Some mental health advocates appreciated the satire as pointing to real failures in the system. Some found the comedy insufficiently attentive to the genuine suffering of people who needed mental health treatment and who were not being served adequately by existing institutions. The episode Stark Raving Dad also established Leon Kompowski as someone who has found in his Michael Jackson persona a form of expression and connection that his ordinary life as Leon doesn't provide, a form of mental health management through persona, through the specific freedom of inhabiting someone else's identity. This is not how the episode frames it explicitly, but it is what the episode's logic implies, and it is one of the more interesting and humane things the episode does with its premise. Ned Flanders' breakdown and institutionalization in the Season 8 episode Hurricane Nettie represents a more sustained and more complex engagement with mental health themes. The episode's revelation that Ned's relentless niceness is the product of behavioral modification therapy conducted when he was a child, that his psychological profile is not a natural character trait, but a constructed one, built on the suppression of genuine anger, is a piece of storytelling that engages seriously with questions about the relationship between therapeutic intervention and authentic selfhood, about what it means to be healed of something when the healing involves replacing one set of responses with another rather than understanding and integrating the original impulse. The episode generated discussion among mental health professionals about its representation of behavioral therapy and its implications. Some found it an unfair caricature of therapeutic practice. Some found it a genuinely interesting exploration of the limits of purely behavioral approaches to psychological intervention. Some found the episode's treatment of the therapy Ned received as a child, the specific images of the child being subjected to what amounts to a behavioral conditioning process, disturbing in ways that they felt the episode's comedy was inadequately attentive to. Homer's various depictions of mental health challenges his struggles with impulse control, his apparent difficulty with sustained attention and working memory, his emotional volatility, his specific combination of profound loyalty with profound obliviousness, have been discussed by psychologists and psychiatrists in various forums as a depiction of what certain developmental and psychological conditions look like in functional but impaired adults. The show has never explicitly attached diagnostic labels to Homer's psychology, but the consistency of his depiction across 36 seasons has produced a character whose psychological profile is internally coherent in ways that make the informal diagnostic discussions meaningful. The broader contribution of The Simpsons to public conversations about mental health is difficult to quantify but probably significant. A show watched by tens of millions of people over several decades that depicted characters navigating psychiatric institutionalization, behavioral modification, psychological crisis, and the specific experiences of living with cognitive and emotional limitations in a world that is not well designed to accommodate those limitations, gave those experiences a visibility and a public discussion that they would not otherwise have had. Whether the specific representations were always accurate or always responsible is a separate question. The fact that the representations existed and that they were embedded in popular entertainment with enormous reach means they were part of how the public understood these experiences. Extended Deep Dive, Season 23, and the question of whether to keep going. By the time The Simpsons reached its 23rd season, which aired in 2011 and 2012, the question of whether the show should continue had been a fixture of entertainment journalism and fan discussion for more than a decade. The show's critics, a constituency that overlapped significantly with its most devoted early fans, had been arguing since roughly season 10 or 11 that the show had passed whatever peak it had occupied in its middle seasons and that continued production was producing work that compared unfavorably to the classic episodes. This argument is, in certain respects, correct. The episodes of the classic period, roughly seasons 3 through 8, with some disagreement about the precise boundaries, contain a concentration of writing of a specific quality that the later seasons do not match with comparable consistency. The jokes are denser. The character logic is more consistent. The satirical targets are more precisely observed. The emotional beats land with more reliability. The craft is, in the aggregate, more impressive. But the argument for stopping is considerably less straightforward than the argument that the later seasons are inferior to the classic period. The argument for stopping assumes that the primary value of the show is the best episodes it has produced, and that the continued production of episodes that do not reach that standard diminishes the archive in some meaningful way. This assumption is worth examining. The episodes produced in the 23rd season are, in general, better than most episodic television produced in the same period. They are funnier than most comedies. They are more ambitious in their satirical targets. They are made with more craft and more care than most of what surrounds them in the television landscape. The relevant comparison is not to the classic Simpsons. The relevant comparison is to what else is available, and by that comparison, the later Simpsons is not a failure. The controversy that the show's continued existence generated in this period was a variety of controversy specific to long-running institutions. The controversy not of what the institution has done, but of what it represents, of whether its continued operation is serving the values it once embodied, or merely trading on the reputation those values established. This is a controversy that has no clean resolution because it depends on what you think the institution is for, and whether you think the current version of it is still doing that thing. The Simpsons is still on. It is still producing new episodes. It is still part of the cultural conversation in ways that most television programs that have been on the air for 36 years are not. Whether this continued presence is a service to its legacy or a complication of it is a question that depends on what you think the legacy is and who you think it belongs to. The show belongs to different people in different ways. To its creators, it is a body of work that continues to develop. To its original fans, it is partly a fixed achievement that the later work cannot touch. To its newer audience, it is simply what The Simpsons is not the early seasons as a separate and superior thing, but the whole continuous enterprise, of which the current episodes are simply the current installments. None of these ownership claims is wrong. They are different relationships to the same object, and the controversy they generate is partly a controversy about which relationship has priority in determining what the show should be. Extended section. The legacy episodes. When Springfield looked in the mirror. One of the quieter traditions in The Simpsons' history is the episode that turns its analytical attention on itself, that takes the show's own nature, history, and cultural position as its explicit subject rather than treating these as background context. These episodes exist in every era of the show's production, and they range in quality and in how directly they acknowledge what they're doing. but collectively they form a kind of internal documentary, the show's ongoing portrait of its own existence and what that existence has meant. The earliest of these is arguably Homer versus Patty and Selma, or certain elements of The Front, but the most explicit early example is Homer Badman, from season 6, which uses its premise about a sexual harassment scandal to comment directly on how media narratives are constructed and how the show itself is consumed and discussed. Homer Badman was written in 1994, in the specific cultural moment of the Clarence Thomas hearings and the O.J. Simpson case and the beginning of a sustained public conversation about sexual harassment that was changing how American institutions address the subject, and the episode is explicitly about that moment while also being about Homer and while also being about how television creates and manages public narratives about individuals. The season 12 mockumentary Behind the Laughter is the show's most explicit self-examination, a direct parody of the VH1 Behind the Music format that takes the Simpsons family as a real family whose rise to television fame, commercial exploitation, internal conflicts, and eventual reconciliation are the subject of a documentary. The episode is very funny, and it is also, if you are willing to read it in a certain way, a genuinely interesting account of what the show has been through, the creative tensions, the commercial pressures, the specific dynamics of a production that has been running long enough to develop its own institutional history. The show's willingness to look at itself in these episodes is part of what has kept it interesting for as long as it has remained interesting. A show that is never willing to turn its analytical attention on its own operations is a show that is pretending to be more innocent than it is. The Simpsons has, with some consistency and some frequency, been willing to acknowledge what it is: a commercial product, a cultural institution, a production involving creative compromises and contractual obligations, and the specific difficulties of sustaining quality across many years and many episodes under conditions that are not designed to optimize for quality. This willingness to look at itself is also part of what makes the scandals intelligible as part of the show's history, rather than as interruptions to it. The scandals are the places where the show's external reality, the world it was commenting on, the world its episodes were part of, pushed back against the show's operations and demanded some kind of response. The internal examinations are the places where the show responded to its own nature without waiting for the external push. Together, they are a portrait of an institution that has been remarkably willing, for a commercial entertainment product, to acknowledge what it actually is. The final hour. What every scandal taught Springfield. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. The kind of time that settles into a listening body like familiar weight, the weight of stories heard at the edge of sleep, of voices that carry through the specific warmth of a room where nothing is urgent. Every scandal we trace through this script taught something about what the show was and what it was trying to do. Let us gather those lessons before we finally leave. The Michael Jackson episode taught that even the most beloved creative decisions are not permanent, and that the people who make popular entertainment are responsible for the full consequences of what they make, including the consequences that become apparent only after years or decades. The lesson is not comfortable. It was not designed to be. The Some Enchanted Evening crisis taught that the catastrophic failures are sometimes the ones that precede the breakthroughs, and that what looks from outside like a smooth ascent is almost always a story of near misses and recoveries, and the specific courage of continuing after you have seen how badly something can go wrong. Homer's phobia taught that the fight to say something true and humane about how people actually live is worth the institutional resistance it generates, and that the episodes that are hardest to get on the air are sometimes the ones that most deserve to be there. The Brazil incident taught that popular entertainment is a form of soft power that operates in the world whether or not the people making it intend it to, and that the consequences of that power are felt by real people in real countries who did not ask to be depicted and who have every right to respond to depictions they find harmful. The China ban taught that the same dynamic operates at a larger scale and with higher political stakes, when the subject being depicted is something that matters to a government with the capacity and the will to act on its objections. The Apu reckoning taught the hardest lesson of all, that harm done with good intentions or without awareness of harm being done is still harm, and that the willingness to continue doing it after the harm has been pointed out is a moral choice rather than a neutral continuation of prior practice. The Principal and the Pauper taught that an institution's relationship with its own continuity is partly a relationship with the trust of the people who have invested in that continuity, and that violating that trust has cost that compound over time, even when the violation was committed in service of a genuine creative intention. Homer Badman taught that the show was always aware of the media environment it operated in, and always willing to use that environment as both subject and mirror. The prediction phenomenon taught that a show that looks at the present carefully enough and honestly enough will produce a record that looks from the future like a record of the future, not because the show was prophetic, but because the present it was examining was always already in the process of becoming the future that surprised us. Mona Simpson's story taught that the personal and the political are never fully separate in Springfield or anywhere else, and that the history of institutional power is always also the history of specific people whose lives were shaped by the decisions that power made. The floating timeline taught that what we cannot bear to end, we find ways to keep going, and that the keeping going is both a form of love and a form of avoidance, and that knowing the difference is harder than it should be. All of these lessons are part of what The Simpsons is, not separate from the comedy and the craft and the extraordinary achievement of what the show has been, part of it, woven through it. Present in it the way history is always present in things that are old enough to have one. Springfield is older now than it was. The characters are exactly the same age they have always been. Both of these things are true. Both of them are part of what the town is. The loop keeps turning, the credits keep rolling, Homer keeps coming home. And somewhere, in a room that smells like old carpet and television light, someone is falling asleep to the sound of Springfield, to the familiar voices and the familiar music, and the 36 years of everything that happened there, the beautiful and the scandalous, and the quietly human, and the surprisingly theological, and the diplomatically complicated, and the racially reckoning, and the perpetually unresolved. It is enough for now. Sleep well. Springfield will be here in the morning. It always is. End of script. Total target. 40,000 plus words. Written for 11 Labs narration, long-form YouTube relaxation format. Extended section. Homer at the bat. When the show recruited baseball's greatest names and caused a minor industry controversy, the logistics of producing Homer at the bat, which aired on the 20th of February 1992 during the third season, were complicated enough that the episode nearly did not happen, and the complications involved reveal something specific about what The Simpsons was willing to do creatively in its early years that most television shows would not have attempted. The episode's premise required recruiting 9 Major League Baseball players to voice themselves as characters in the episode: Wade Boggs, Ken Griffey Jr., Steve Sachs, Ozzie Smith, Jose Canseco, Don Mattingly, Darryl Strawberry, Roger Clemens, and Mike Scioscia. Each of these players was, in 1992, either at the height of his career or approaching it, and each was famous enough that his involvement in the episode was itself a news item. The coordination required to get 9 professional athletes to record voice work for an animated comedy, to write coherent story arcs for each of them, and to do all of this within the normal production schedule of a television show that was already demanding significant resources from its creative team was, by most accounts, substantial. The baseball players each received their own comedic subplot, and the subplots were designed specifically to play on or against each player's public image. Ken Griffey Jr., known for his effortless grace as a player, develops a gigantism condition from drinking too much of Mr. Burns's performance-enhancing tonic. Jose Canseco, then, amid the early controversies about steroid use that would become the central story of his career, is depicted as a model citizen rescuing children from a burning building. Don Mattingly is sent home by Mr. Burns because his sideburns do not conform to the team's grooming standards, even as Mattingly keeps shaving more of his hair, the joke being that his sideburns were essentially non-existent, but Burns kept seeing them. The episode generated a specific variety of industry conversation about what it meant to have professional athletes appearing as themselves in satirical contexts that were not entirely flattering. The players who agreed to participate had presumably read the scripts before recording, but the specific satirical uses to which their likenesses were put and the degree to which the comedy was organized around gentle mockery of their public images raised questions about the nature of the consent involved, about what the precedent being set meant for future celebrity appearances in animated contexts. The baseball industry's response was generally positive, partly because the episode was an enormous success with audiences, and partly because the specific variety of comedy involved was affectionate rather than hostile. The show was clearly a fan of baseball and of these players, and the comedy was organized around celebration as much as mockery. But the episode set a template for celebrity participation in The Simpsons that would shape the show's approach to guest appearances for decades, the template of recruiting celebrities willing to engage with self-deprecating comedy and to allow the show to use their public images in ways that played on or subverted audience expectations. The logistical complexity of Homer at the bat and its enormous success made it a model that the show would return to repeatedly, the celebrity-heavy episode that recruited famous names willing to play versions of themselves, to be funny about themselves, to participate in the show's satirical project rather than simply receiving the flattery of a cameo. The episodes that followed this model over the decades included some of the show's most celebrated work and some of its most controversial. The model itself, the show as a space where celebrities could engage with their own mythology in ways that required a degree of self-awareness and a willingness to be a target as well as a participant, is one of the show's most significant and most imitated innovations. Final extended section: What Springfield meant, what Springfield means, what Springfield will mean. There is a version of this story that ends with a definitive assessment of what The Simpsons has been and what it has meant, a final accounting that weighs the scandals against the achievements, that reaches a verdict on the legacy, that tells you clearly and with appropriate authority what to think about 36 years of the most culturally significant animated television show in the history of the medium. That version of the story does not exist because the subject of the story does not permit it. The Simpsons is too large and too various, and too entangled with too many different histories and too many different people's experiences of it to be reduced to a verdict. It is the kind of thing that means different things in different contexts, that has been part of different conversations at different moments, that contains within itself enough material for almost any position you want to take on what popular entertainment is, and what it is for, and what it owes the people who make it, and the people who watch it, and the people it depicts. What it was, at its most essential, was an attempt by a group of creative people, over a very long time, to say something true about American life using the specific tools available to an animated comedy on a commercial broadcast network. The attempt was not always successful. The tools were not always adequate to what the attempt required. The conditions under which the attempt was made, the network, the schedules, the advertising relationships, the specific cultural moment, the specific people involved shaped what was possible in ways that sometimes supported and sometimes constrained the attempt. But the attempt was real. The commitment was real. The specific willingness to keep looking at the difficult things, to keep turning the satirical attention toward the targets that were hardest to hit fairly and most important to hit anyway, to keep asking the questions that Springfield's residents could not ask because the radiation or the dream or the collective denial or the institutional corruption had damaged the part of them responsible for asking this. Willingness was real and sustained across an extraordinary period of time. The scandals are part of that record, not separate from the achievement, part of it. The places where the attempt to do something true met the resistance of a world that did not always want true things done to it. Some of that resistance was legitimate, some of it was not. All of it was part of the story. Springfield is not on any map. It is everywhere and nowhere, as we have established. But the story of what happened there, the full story, including the parts that the show would rather not discuss, and the parts that the show never knew to discuss, and the parts that everyone involved has discussed at exhausting length, that story is as fixed and specific and historically real as any other story about a place that existed in time and that left a record of its existence. The lights are on in Springfield. They have been on since the 17th of December, 1989. They will be on when you wake up from whatever sleep this narration carried you into. They will be on tomorrow and next week and next season, in whatever form next season takes. And Homer will be in Sector 7G, leaning back in his chair, doing the specific inadequate job that he has been doing for 36 years, sustained by the specific love of a family that has forgiven him approximately 788 times, in a town that has forgotten approximately 788 catastrophes, under the shadow of a cooling tower that has been leaking its quiet, invisible poison into the water table since before most of the people watching were born. The fish have 3 eyes. The sky is the same yellow as everyone's skin. The monorail is broken in a desert somewhere. The real Seymour Skinner is still tied to a train, expelled into whatever exists outside Springfield's geography, carrying a truth that the town made illegal because the truth was more expensive than the lie. And Maggie is watching. She is always watching. She is the only one in the family who has always understood what she was watching. And she is still, after all this time, after everything that has happened and been forgotten and happened again, waiting for exactly the right moment to say what she knows. When she speaks, we will all finally hear what Springfield has been trying to tell us. Until then, sleep. The loop keeps turning. The show keeps going. And Springfield, beautiful, poisoned, impossible, American, dreaming Springfield will be exactly where you left it when you come back. It always is. End of script, 40,000 plus words. Written for 11 Labs narration and long-form YouTube relaxation format. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. Extended section. 22 short films about Springfield. The episode that proved the town was bigger than the family. There are episodes of The Simpsons that work by focusing tightly on a single character or a single situation and extracting everything that situation has to offer. And there are episodes that work by expanding, by pulling back the camera and revealing that the world the show has been depicting is larger and stranger and more populated than any single episode has been able to show. 22 short films about Springfield, which aired on the 14th of April 1996, is the purest example of the second kind of episode, and it is one of the show's most formally interesting achievements. The episode abandons the Simpson family almost entirely. It is structured as a series of short vignettes, each focusing on a different secondary character in Springfield. Apu at the Quick E-Mart, Skinner and Superintendent Chalmers at a dinner that goes catastrophically wrong, Chief Wiggum and Snake Jailbird, Professor Frink, Dr. Nick, Sideshow Mel, Bumblebee Man, and the Barbershop Quartet, among others. Each vignette is self-contained and complete. Together they create a portrait of Springfield as a place with genuine density, a town where the background characters the Simpson family has been brushing past for 7 seasons have their own lives, their own conflicts, their own moments of comedy and grace. The formal ambition of the episode was controversial in the specific way that formal ambition is always controversial in a long-running television show. It required the audience to invest in characters they had only ever experienced as decoration, and it required the show to deliver on that investment in 22 compressed story fragments without the safety net of the main characters and their established emotional dynamics. The episode worked. The steamed ham segment, in which Skinner tries to conceal from Superintendent Chalmers that he has burned the roast and that the aurora borealis he claims is responsible for the smell is in fact his kitchen on fire, has become one of the most discussed and most celebrated pieces of comedy the show ever produced. It has been analyzed, remixed, parodied, and referenced at a frequency that suggests something about it touches a nerve that purely plot-driven comedy does not reach. What 22 short films contributed to the show's broader project was proof that the world it had built was genuinely inhabited. Springfield was not a backdrop for the Simpson family. It was a place, with residents who had textures and histories and comic possibilities that the show had only been gesturing at. This proof mattered for the show's credibility as a piece of world-building, and it mattered for the audience's understanding of what kind of show they had been watching for 7 seasons. The episode generated less external controversy than many of the ones discussed in this script, but it generated significant internal conversation about what The Simpsons was and what it could do about whether an episode that largely abandoned its main characters was an appropriate use of the show's resources, about whether the secondary characters could sustain the weight the episode placed on them, about what the show owed its audience in terms of the characters the audience had come to see. The answers the episode provided were decisive. The secondary characters could carry the weight. The town was big enough for the show to explore without its main family at the center. And the audience was willing, even eager, to spend time with Apu and Skinner and Wiggum and the others as protagonists rather than decoration. Springfield had been waiting to be seen fully since the beginning. 22 short films was the first time the show stepped back far enough to show it. A final note on sleep and what it offers. All of these stories, the scandals and the fights and the diplomatic incidents and the creative reckoning and the beautiful moments that exist alongside the harmful ones, are part of what you carry with you when you fall asleep. To the sound of Springfield. Sleep is the place where the things you have heard settle into you without your active participation, where the stories you have been told find their places in whatever architecture your mind builds and maintains, where the distance between what you know and what you feel about what you know sometimes closes in ways that waking thought does not permit. The Simpsons has been part of that settling for millions of people across 36 years. The show that played on the television in the background while you fell asleep as a child. The episodes you watch during the specific kinds of loneliness that come in early adulthood, when the familiar is a comfort that you have only recently learned you needed. The episodes that surprised you by being sadder than you expected them to be, or funnier, or stranger, or truer about something you had not expected a cartoon to know. These experiences are yours. They belong to you in a way that the show's creators do not control and the show's scandals do not undo. The specific place that Springfield occupies in your own history of watching and listening and being kept company by voices coming out of a screen, that is something that exists between you and the show in a way that is not available to anyone else. Take it with you into sleep. Let the stories settle. Let the voices fade. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. Good night. The Weight of 36 Years, a closing reflection. There is something that happens when a story has been going on long enough, when it has accumulated enough seasons, enough episodes, enough moments of genuine grace and genuine failure and genuine surprise, where the story stops being just a story and becomes something closer to a companion, something you have lived alongside rather than simply consumed, something whose presence in your life is so extended and so familiar that its absence would feel like the loss of something that has actual weight. The Simpsons has become that kind of companion for a remarkable number of people, across a remarkable range of ages and circumstances and cultural contexts. The child who watched it in 1990 is now in their 40s. The teenager who discovered it in syndication in 2001 is now in their 30s. The college student who stayed up watching classic episodes on streaming platforms in 2015 is now in their late 20s. There are people for whom The Simpsons is the longest-running continuous presence in their entertainment lives. The show that was there before almost anything else was there, and that is still there now. This is an unusual thing to be true of a commercial television program. It is unusual to be true of anything. The sustained presence, across more than 3 decades, of a creative work in the emotional landscape of tens of millions of people's lives is not something that happens by accident or by commercial calculation alone. It happens because the thing being sustained has something in it that the people sustaining their attention to it genuinely need, something that keeps delivering, even in attenuated form, even in the later seasons that the critics rightly note do not reach the heights of the classic period, something that the audience finds worth returning to. What that something is will be different for different people. For some, it is the comedy, specifically the particular variety of joke construction that the show developed in its classic period. The density and speed of the references, the way a great Simpsons joke rewards attentiveness by offering multiple levels of appreciation simultaneously. For some, it is the characters, the specific emotional truth of Homer and Marge's marriage, of Lisa's intelligent isolation, of Bart's performed indifference and genuine loyalty, of Maggie's watchful silence. For some, it is simply the familiarity, the specific comfort of a world that is strange in consistent, predictable, beloved ways. All of these are real and valid reasons to keep watching. And the scandals and the controversies and the reckonings and the creative failures are not reasons to stop, because they are part of the same thing, part of what it means for a creative institution to have existed long enough to have a genuine history, to have made mistakes that can be identified and examined, to have participated in the ongoing conversation about what American life is and what it means in ways that left traces. The traces are what we have been following in this script. The specific places where the show touched the world and the world pushed back. The specific decisions that had consequences. The specific moments of courage and cowardice and creative ambition and commercial compromise and genuine artistic achievement. All of it is Springfield. All of it is part of what the town is and what it has been for the 36 years it has existed in the American imagination, on American screens, in American living rooms and bedrooms and college dorms and wherever else. People have watched television and fallen asleep to its light. The last episode has not aired yet. The last scandal has not happened yet. The last creative decision that will need to be examined and reckoned with has not been made yet. Springfield is still going, and we are still there with it, in the way we have always been there with it, watching, remembering, sometimes falling asleep in the middle, always finding our way back to the couch by the next episode. The loop keeps turning. The family is still on the couch. The television is still on. Good night, Springfield. Good night.